Most of the game companies we've looked at have similar traits. A lot of them are northern, for example, mostly filled up with people who would rather not be on camera. That and the odd ones who welcome it, at least until everything suddenly goes tits up. Today though, we have a company that actually managed to carry it off a lot better than most, and they weren't northern. It's finally time to look at the Bitmap Brothers. Now, we've actually covered a bunch of their games in the past already, but they are pretty damn good, so it's certainly worth playing them again. And the story behind them's something to boot. So, without any further ado, let's go. The name Bitmap Brothers gives the impression of at least two people kicking everything off, like the Chemical Brothers, Dangerous Brothers, Hanson Brothers, that sort of thing. However, before there were any bitmaps, there was Mike Montgomery, a retail manager at Woolworths who got his start programming code on the ZX81 in 1980, later moving on to the Spectrum. For the first half of the decade, computing was a simple hobby, making disassemblers, hacking things here and there. However, he knew literally no one else who was doing the same thing. He didn't know how good he was, so as a way of measuring this, he went to interview for a job at Popular Computing Weekly in the mid-80s. He was told he could start on Monday, which kinda took him aback somewhat. After a quick period of negotiation and more formal goodbyes from Woolworths, a week later Mike Montgomery had found himself in the computer industry, almost by accident. Not bad for someone who, a few years prior, didn't even know what a computer was when confronted by the printouts that Woolies were using. The next step was meeting Steve Kelly, which happened in the mid-80s. Of all games, they worked together on a computer version of Scrabble. Kelly did the Specky version, and Montgomery did the C64 version. They soon did the same for versions of Monopoly and Cluedo, and that was when Eric Matthews came along for the ride. All the Bitmaps decided to get together from there, working on their first game, Xenon, a game originally made by Kelly for the Atari ST, and then ported to the Amiga by Montgomery. The formation of the Bitmap Brothers was something that quite naturally just ended up falling into place. Xenon would also end up providing the bitmaps with their initial big break. This top-down shooter, a fairly impressive one graphically that was quite well reviewed by magazines of the time, would end up being featured on the ITV children's show Get Fresh. Kids could call in and play the game over the phone, and if they were successful, they'd win a prize. Pretty much immediately, just after their very first game, the bitmaps had a strong reputation, and they would capitalise on it pretty fast. Being based in Wapping, at the time the UK's home of newspaper and print publication, the Bitmaps quickly decided that they needed to build an image that would make them stand out and wasn't just a group of faceless game developers. And so they decided to change that. The Bitmaps cultivated a cool image in the press. Sunglasses, suitable 80s hair, good fashion, denim and leather and all that good stuff. True rockstar developers. While this didn't necessarily translate to all-night cocaine binges and chucking Amigas out of windows or whatever, it meant that there was a hell of a lot more swagger about them. One of the most enduring images of the bitmaps out there is the classic shot of Montgomery, Kelly and Matthews standing on a roof in front of a helicopter. Which of course wasn't theirs. This was the roof of the Mirror building, and said chopper belonged to Mr. Black Magic himself, media tycoon and unholy tyrant Robert Maxwell. The Bitmaps waited all day on that roof for Maxwell to be flown back from the horse racing at Epsom to get 10 minutes with that chopper, but it was worth it. The Bitmaps were having their games published by Mirrorsoft at the time, and had it in their contract that the Bitmaps name should be pushed just as much as the games themselves were. This, just as much as the games, is one of the main reasons why the name of the Bitmap Brothers is so well known today, much more than a lot of other developers. They strove to push their name as much as they could, meaning lots of press for them, just as much as there was for the games. Mike Montgomery later on explained it concisely: you don't buy an Apple record, you buy a Beatles album. The approach of the Bitmaps was a response to the traditional ways of game marketing, wherein the publishers like Ocean and US Gold were the stars, and developers barely got any time. And needless to say, their approach was influential. It also extended to their games. There were always themes and motifs, little or small, that were the signatures of the Bitmaps and marked one of their games out as explicitly a Bitmap Brothers game. And as we go on to look at their games now, we'll see a bunch of them. Let's begin then with the Bitmaps from 1988 to around about 1990. To start with, we'll go right back to Xenon. The first Bitmaps game, originally released for the Atari ST in 1988, but shown here on the Amiga, resulted in a very quick breakthrough for them as mentioned. You play as a ship that can travel either in the air or on the ground, depending on the situation, You can usually switch between the two pretty easily, although some bosses force you to take one or the other. David Whittaker provides a high-octane soundtrack, and the game, well, it's just blasting fins pretty much. A kinda typical shooter, but it came at the right time when arcade-style games like this were becoming more commonplace on the Amiga. In fact, Xenon actually did receive a port to the arcades, although the machine itself ran on Amiga hardware called Arcadia. A very popular game at the time, Xenon got ports to plenty of other systems, including the C64 and Spectrum. Again, this is the only Bitmaps game to receive ports onto the 8-bit micros. Has it aged well? Well, not particularly. It's a very tricky shooter indeed, almost unfair right from the get-go, and the graphics and speed haven't aged particularly well. Still, you can see what made it such a popular game at the time. One other thing of note is the secret message hidden in the game's code, which makes the Bitmap's feelings on software pirates pretty clear.
Pirates are the filth of the fucking world. 3 people have spent 7 months on this product, and scumbags rip it off in a couple of minutes. Yeah, very funny, ain't it?
And you can understand their frustrations. The beta for Xenon, then called Kelly X, was leaked onto the scene in 1987, months before the commercial release came out. Still, Xenon is also a landmark title in that it was the first Amiga game to appear in the UK overall top 40 for game sales. Ultimately, the game made a profit on its £25,000 advance, a figure that seems remarkable in this day and age. Xenon was published by Melbourne House, but the Bitmaps soon signed a contract with Mirrorsoft to publish games on their Imageworks label. They followed Xenon up with the original Speedball in the same year, 1988. Now, the story behind the game is quite fun. Originally, the Bitmaps were commissioned to make a game for Mastertronic based on, of all things, real tennis. You know, the very posh sport that's mostly played by the gentry and royals. This plan fell through when Mastertronic completely changed their mind, but the Bitmaps decided to roll with it, switching up the game completely, throwing the real tennis stuff in the bin, and literally writing the ideas for Speedball down on the back of a packet of silk cut in the pub. The end result was a top-down future sports game, one of the first of its kind, featuring a violent mixture of handball and ice hockey, where players grab the ball out of the sky, bash the hell out of each other, and try to get the ball into the opposing goal. Points are scored either through goals or injuring the other team, and there's a bunch of power-ups that can help you out in these quick-fire tussles. It's certainly a big switch from real tennis to this rollerball-esque piece, although actually, the Bitmaps didn't see rollerball until after the game was released and everyone started talking about the connection. The regular Speedball is, again, not a game that has aged too well, but it's still pretty fun to play simply because the action is so fast and furious, and yet there is a certain strategy to what's going on. Unlike a lot of Bitmap Brothers games, the original Speedball can be a bit easy. So long as you can get your players into a certain position, it seems like you can score 8 to 9 times out of 10. Of course, getting there is the trouble. It's alright, a very good, solidly 16-bit affair. And technically this received an 8-bit port too. In 1991 the game was released on the NES as Clash Ball. A half-decent game, albeit one that is kind of eclipsed by its sequel. Speaking of sequels, the Bitmaps released their biggest game to date in 1989, Xenon 2 Mega Blast, one of the biggest Amiga games of what was one of the computer's banner years. Named after the song by Bomb the Bass that features in the game itself, Xenon 2 Mega Blast has the honour of being the first game to feature a largely accurate rendition of a commercial pop song in the soundtrack. Short of a couple of samples, the title music is the same as the pop song. The game itself is even simpler than Xenon. The morphing ship is gone, and instead you've got a straight-ahead space shooter with these odd little fungal surroundings. Xenon 2 is definitely a lot better than the original, although again it does show its age. The difficulty level is legendary. A lot of European shoot-em-ups are hard, and this is one of the very toughest of the lot. Even the shop halfway through, ran by the Predator of all people, will barely help you. It's a very tough game, and sometimes the controls can be a bit irritating. It's not bad at all though, it deserved the success that it got in 1989, that's for damn sure. Xenon 2 also has the dubious honour of being arguably the worst shoot-em-up on the Mega Drive. It received an utterly botched port in late 1991 which lost the almighty soundtrack almost entirely, ran much slower than the Amiga version, and cut out an entire level. How this port came to be so horrific? I don't know. After this bout of arcade action, the Bitmaps gave us something very different. 1990's Cadaver was their most complex game to date. This is a very tough adventure-type game. It feels like an evolution from the classic old specky isometric games like Nightlaw and what have you, with much more in the way of things to do. I find this game to be kind of hard to pick up, but once you know what you're doing, it can be really engrossing. There's a few different ways to solve the puzzles on offer, and there's a lot of tricks and traps to keep you on your toes. I'm no good at this game, but it's recognisably very good and still lovely looking. It rightly got fantastic reviews. If you like the old isometric games or stuff like Landstalker and Equinox, this game's for you too. Cadaver was followed by an expansion pack, The Payoff, which was released in the following year. The Bitmap's first 4 games were all pretty good, certainly for the time, but true greatness would wait until their 5th game, 1990's Speedball 2 Brutal Deluxe. I have spoken extensively about this game before, but it is the definition of exactly what a sequel should be. Everything that was good about the original is here, only improved by a factor of 10. Brutal Deluxe is the greatest and most exhilarating future sports game of them all. Everything feels so much better, the impact of the blows is shocking, there's not so many cheap goals, the arena has a load more features. It's almost perfect. Literally, the only things that are wrong with this game is that you wish the league season would wrap over instead of there just being 2 years worth of play. Speedball 2 is one of the Amiga's greatest games, and it showed just how good a game the Bitmaps could make. What an incredible title. One of those games that just flat out speaks for itself. Speedball 2 would be the last game that the Bitmaps would release for Imageworks, seeing as they were already a games developer with a strong image and every game they'd released so far had been a hit. The relationship between the Imageworks and the Bitmaps was kind of fractious at times, mainly because Bitmap did not like working with other publishers. The original trifecta now had a few more additions: Mark Coleman and Dan Malone, graphic devs extraordinaire. People like Ed Bartlett, Jamie Barber and John Phillips also joined the group, and there were frequent collaborators and links with other companies. In particular, a strong link between the Bitmaps and another small group who'd formed around the same time and made splashes of their own, Sensible Software. Ultimately, the Bitmaps were too big to simply be a developer working for another publisher. They were never particularly comfortable taking orders from publishers at all, and thus the relationship with Imageworks ended. This, in one way, proved to be quite timely. The Imageworks story ended in spectacularly devastating fashion in the months following late 1991, when Robert Maxwell fell off a yacht. However, one upshot of this was that because of the destruction of Mirrorsoft and the Maxwell Empire, the Bitmaps received barely any royalties for Speedball 2, which was a huge blow for them at the time. Anyway, the Bitmaps decided to do it all themselves and created their own publishing imprint, Renegade Software. This was quite a different move for the time. Self-publishing was pretty common back in the early 80s, but the practice had faded somewhat as the budget for making games had increased and publishers had become more high-profile. Indeed, it was fairly common for devs to sign up with multiple publishers at this point. It was a sign of intent on part of the Bitmaps, and certainly a flash of bravado that showed their intention to bring themselves and computer gaming to the forefront on the Amiga. The Renegade label was mainly used for their games, but it would publish games by a few others. Much like the Bitmaps themselves, they didn't publish much, but what they did publish was all pretty damn quality. I mean, let's just look at Renegade's releases, starting with the biggest of them all. The Bitmap Brothers and Sensible Software relationship was largely based on Mike Montgomery's friendly, at least most of the time, rivalry and friendship with Sensi co-founder John Hare. The Essex-born ponytailed balladeer extraordinaire and Montgomery have worked together quite a lot in the years since, but it all started with 2 young teams, both of whom wanted to be visible developers and take away attention from the publishers, having a good battle with the other. At one point, the Bitmaps were referred to as the Bitmap Wankers in Sensi's company phone book. Still, they'd ultimately come together, with Renegade publishing the original Sensible Soccer. It's worth mentioning that Sensible also had a deal with Mirrorsoft for Megalomania, which would have in the future included Sensible Soccer and Cannon Fodder in the bargain. So yeah, they got pretty screwed by the Maxwell Empire's collapse too. Again, Sensible Soccer isn't a game I need to write a hell of a lot about. I can refer you to the 4-part video series I did on the Sensi games. But yeah, it's pretty good. In fact, it's pretty much the greatest football game of them all. Just the right speed mixed with endless playability, a game that is addictive to a ridiculous degree, and one of the best multiplayer games of all time. Sensi would become one of the Amiga's most popular titles, if not its most popular title full stop. From its original release, Sensi and its various incarnations would almost always be at or near the top of the charts. And Renegade's involvement didn't stop with the original. The label published all Amiga Sensi games, from the original through to SWOS and its final incarnation, Sensible World of Soccer 96-97. Another developer who had a good relationship with Renegade was Andrew Braybrook and Steve Turner's almighty Graft Gold. Arguably one of the greatest devs of the 8-bit micro era, these legends had struggled a fair bit thanks to the end of relationships with Hewson and, in particular, Activision, but were helped along in the 16-bit era by both Virgin on the consoles and, in particular, Renegade on computers. Renegade published 3 superb games by Graft Gold, all of which had initially been promised to Mirrorsoft before, again, the whole Maxwell Yacht Death pension fraud thing. Can you see something of a pattern emerging here? The first of these was Fire and Ice, a slippy and slidey platformer featuring a very cute hero where you collect bits of a key in order to progress. It looks really nice, as Graft Gold games often do, and isn't a bad player. For me, this is one of the better Amiga platformers. Sadly never came out for the Mega Drive as was planned, but an 8-bit version did arrive. In particular, a Master System version that only ever saw release in Brazil. Uridium 2, a sequel to the seminal 8-bit shooter, came out for the Amiga only in 1993. The core gameplay is much the same. You fly over the top of an enemy base, you can go left and right destroying things, and you have to get through a few waves of enemies before getting the call to land. A boss has been added now though, which gets you inside of the ship. It's okay, but it does lack the original's immediacy a bit for me. The best Graft Gold Renegade release for me though is the almighty Virocop, a game which is connected to the earlier Quasitron. This is a brilliantly made and thoroughly creative little shooter with design that just puts a smile on your face, and it plays great too. This is a fantastic game. It's a shame that it's not very well known, probably because it only ever came out for the Amiga, and in 1995 at that, by which time the system was really fading out, but it's highly recommended by me. There's a few more games here too. One of the highest profile ones being Factor 5's Turrican 3 for the Amiga, which was published by Renegade in most of Europe, barring Germany. Doesn't need much introduction. It's Turrican, outstanding action, and one of the best soundtracks ever courtesy of Chris Hulsbeck. Number 3 is more straight ahead than most Turricans, but still very good indeed. Then there's Elfmania, an odd Japanese-ish fighting game by Terramark. These guys are better known as Housemarque, a Finnish developer who make the Stardust games and are still very much around today. It's okay as far as these things go. It kinda plays like Yaya Kung Fu more than any contemporary fighter. Not bad, but not a patch on Shadow Fighter. And how about 1994's Rough and Tumble? Like Virocop, this is another excellent and very late Amiga game, a fabulous run and gunner, almost like what Metal Slug would be if it were an Amiga game. Awesome. The game was made by Wunderkind, a British developer who only ever released this one game. Finally, Renegade published Interactive Binaries' Flight of the Amazon Queen, which is a fairly fun point-and-clicker in the LucasArts mould. Not bad, and some great characters and all that, but people do kinda regard the puzzles as somewhat annoying. Still, it's definitely a cult title. So those are all of the non-Bitmap Brother Renegade software games pretty much. There's still a couple more for PlayStation. And damn, while there's not a lot of them, it's a pretty fearsome lineup. Even the lesser releases here are quality, and the best of them are all-time classics. If you're publishing the likes of every classic sensible soccer game, Virocop, Turrican 3, and Rough and Tumble, you're definitely doing something right. They certainly weren't releasing any old gubbins. And they did well by developers too. The profits for all games on the Renegade label were shared 50-50 between Renegade and the developer. Not the most profitable way of doing things, certainly not something that a lot of publishers would have done, but it was fair. But of course Renegade was also used as a label for the main event, the Bitmap Brothers. There's 4 more of those games to look at now under the Renegade label, so let's do it and jump right back to 1991. Gods might actually be the first Bitmaps title that I was aware of. The magazine pictures of it made it look particularly incredible. And as the first Bitmaps title to be published on the Renegade label, it kinda had to be something pretty special. And yeah, it certainly shifted some units. You play as someone who's looking to join the pantheon of the gods, and has to defeat several guardians in order to get there. And of course get through several levels of ancient Greek-style platforming and puzzling action. Gods, as it turns out, has mostly held up pretty well. Unlike, say, Xenon, the platforming here is still quite strong, as are the looks and all that. And of course, the difficulty is again massive. It will not take much at all for this game to kill you outright if you put a foot one. These days I kind of feel it's better if you use a trainer and enable infinite lives. I have a lot more fun that way. At one point in more modern times, this game seemed to be dredged up quite often and thought of as an old school Dark Souls. I do get that, sort of, at least in terms of difficulty, risk and reward, that sort of thing. The game got a spectacular reception though, and was ported most everywhere at the time. Definitely one of the Bitmap's bigger hits. It's still worth playing, but prepare yourself for punishment. As with Xenon 2, Gods used an established artist for the game's soundtrack. John Fox, under his Nation 12 alter ego, provided the memorable theme music to the game. Magic Pockets, the second Bitmap Renegade release, was another hit. Like Xenon, this was thanks to its appearance as a phone game on a kids show, this time the ITV show Motormouth, where folks would shout things like jump and zap into their phone to control a game. In keeping with tradition, there was more commercial music, this time an instrumental version of Betty Boop's Doin' the Do. You play as a cool dude known as the Bitmap Kid, who beats enemies by trapping them with his massive pockets that he can chuck around willy-nilly. It seems like people do remember this one a fair bit, but honestly, I've never liked it that much. It always feels kind of drab to me, and the pocket gimmick is kinda silly. Not the Bitmap's best, I feel. There was a little gap between Magic Pockets and the next title, during which time the Bitmaps worked on a couple of titles that never saw the light of day, in particular a futuristic racing title that's known variously as Bike, Havoc, or Triple X. A third speedball game was also in the works for a brief period. In the end, however, all of these fell by the wayside. Indeed, almost 2 years passed from Magic Pockets to the next Bitmaps game, and hoo boy was it worth waiting for. Again, I've already covered the Chaos Engine pretty extensively in the past, a steampunk, gauntlet-esque action title where you pick two hard-nailed hired guns for a mission to destroy the titular machine and save the world from out-of-control monsters. This game is, quite simply, amazing. Inspiring. The action is first-rate, the soundtrack is a brutal smash of hammering wavy goodness, there's all those voice samples, and every level is great. I don't really need to say that it's difficult, I mean, it's a Bitmaps game, but it's hard in a way that's more rewarding than just about any other Bitmaps title. One of those games you can lose yourself in, something that always springs to my mind. It's brilliant, one of the truly great Amiga titles. It's also pretty great on the Mega Drive and SNES too as it goes, although it was inexplicably renamed Soldiers of Fortune in the US. Phenomenal. For a lot of people, the Chaos Engine was the Bitmap's greatest achievement to date. Even by their high standards, they'd surpassed themselves with this one. If any game could be picked as evidence in 1993 to show that the Amiga was still an ongoing concern, it was probably this one. Naturally, a sequel was going to be hyped pretty damn hard, and when it was announced in 1994, the magazines went crazy over it. Set for release in the summer of '95, the early months were filled with hype for the Chaos Engine sequel, which promised to deliver even more of the original's brilliance. The Bitmaps were certainly talking it up big, of that there's no doubt, and they had a lot to say. Amiga magazine Le One not only ran a cover feature on the game, but a series of 4 in-depth previews in the months after. Even Amiga Power got on the train somewhat. And yet neither Le One nor Amiga Power would live long enough to see the Chaos Engine 2 finally get released. What exactly happened with the Chaos Engine 2 then? It's a little tricky to say. A lot of things really. The original game itself was quite expensive to make, and there were a lot of issues with the engine to sort out, in particular for the game to function in the way that the Bitmaps wanted it to. In the main though, Chaos 2 was a casualty of the transition from Amiga to PC, with the studio working on their first proper PC game, Z, at the same time. The Bitmaps were still a fairly small group and resources were finite, and so Chaos 2 suffered hugely. Console versions of the game were prototyped but soon cancelled, and the game kinda slipped into development hell, delay after delay after delay. From a proposed summer '95 release, the game slipped all the way to late 1996. It went from a glorious Amiga send-off to, ultimately, barely even an afterthought. Barely anyone was playing games on the Migi in late '96, and so Chaos 2 came out to barely any reception. And in the end, it's kind of disappointing. The big idea for Chaos 2 was to change the game from a cooperative experience to a head-to-head spy versus spy-esque one, where you now compete with your fellow mercenary to complete levels, get money, and otherwise engage in combat. In patches it works, but it's kind of clunky, and a far cry from the original experience. It doesn't help that the game kind of feels unfinished. The levels are so basic and bland, and even 2 of the original cast have been dropped from it. The flair of the original just isn't there, and it feels like it was just put out in order to stop everyone from complaining. A very disappointing end to the Bitmap's glorious Amiga years, and the way too late arrival is only one reason for that. In the end, it's just not that good a game. The Chaos Engine 2 is the worst Bitmaps title we've looked at up to this point, a real shame all things considered. Mike Montgomery has said that he kind of regretted releasing the game in the end, and feels that in the end it should have been canned. With the Amiga market so small at that point, it only sold around 4,000 copies, and thousands of extra copies were basically thrown out. Still, it was time to look to the future, and as small as the Bitmaps were, they were determined to survive the transition from 2D to 3D. Their first gambit would be, again, something new for them, a real-time strategy game. The transition to the 3D years was tough on a lot of developers. Suddenly, the costs of game making went way higher. If you could, then hiring more people was necessary. Also, failure was quite simply not an option. If a project failed in the 16-bit days, then it was often painful but survivable. A failed project now, though, could easily sink you. Many of the Amiga folk didn't survive. Graft Gold is sadly a good example. While they developed a couple of PlayStation games under Renegade, International Motor X and a version of Rainbow Islands, previously a classic port for the Spectrum, it wasn't enough, and after being bought by Time Warner in 1996, they folded completely in 1998. Sensible Software, arguably the kins of the Amiga, were an even more brutal example. The failure to convert the ambitious and very expensive Sex and Drugs and Rock and Roll into a game all but killed them, and 3D updates to Sensible Soccer just didn't work out sales-wise. In 1999, the company was sold to Codemasters and folded. Another casualty, as it goes, was the Bitmaps publishing label. In 1996, Renegade Software was sold to Time Warner Interactive. As much as it was a good thing to self-publish, by this point it was too expensive for the Bitmaps to do. Ultimately, when Time Warner Interactive was sold to GT, the Renegade label was dropped completely. The Bitmaps would go back to just being independent developers once more, and decided to go for PC development. Their first proper 32-bit generation game would be published by Virgin Interactive. Fortunately, it's one that a lot of you probably know. Zed was one of the Bitmaps' biggest and most expensive projects, around about £2 million I think. The game was originally destined for the Amiga, and there were even working versions of the game made for it, but ultimately it was one of those games that just grew and went to the PC. Mike Montgomery has said that in total, the game took around 4.5 years to make from original idea to release. Most of this was down to the cutscenes, which were necessitated by the move from floppy disks to CDs, and the publisher's requirement to fill up 680 megs of disk space compared to the single floppy that the game was designed for. Zed was a popular RTS back in the day, a game set in a robotic world where you play as 2 grunts named Alan and Brad on a delivery mission for the almighty cigar-chomping leader General Zod. Suddenly this mission involves fighting enemy soldiers and taking over planets, as it does. The game's certainly very personable, funny cutscenes, lots of speech and so on. It was regarded back in the day as a somewhat more irreverent Command & Conquer, which we'll get back to, only with the difficulty severely jacked up, very challenging AI for the time. Now, as you can probably tell, RTS games are my weak spot. I just don't understand them. As far as RTSs go, I know this is well regarded, and it seems like it would be definitely fun if I understood the genre. So I can give it a pass, although really my opinion on RTSs is not one to be followed. There are various ways to play it. This is the PlayStation version of the original, which was ported by Chrysalis. It's fine as far as console RTSs go, although the original PC version is assuredly better. There is a port on Steam, but apparently it's of a mobile version and not very good. But there is also an open source Zod Engine remake that is apparently fine and focuses on multiplayer. Zed would prove to be a pretty strong title for the Bitmaps, and not a bad entry into the new generation. Aside from America, it was a big success just about everywhere in the West, and especially in Russia, and one of the Bitmaps' biggest selling titles. But still, cash remained tight as the American market gradually took a stranglehold on the gaming business. There was also quiet movements against them, such as Zed's lead programmer being snapped up by Westwood Studios, who would immediately deploy him on the upcoming Command & Conquer, along with a bunch of stuff from Zed that he'd taken with him. The first Zed was, as it happens, the Bitmap's last game for 4 years. Indeed, it could even be considered in some ways as the final truly major Bitmap's title. What happened in those 4 years? Well, as far as Zed goes, the sequel to it took a long time, in particular because the Bitmaps transitioned from 2D to 3D for it. That and the publishers, now GT Interactive, seemed to be clicking their heels when it came to a sequel. Things kinda went pretty quiet, and in the end there was only Montgomery left as far as the big boys went. At least until 2000, when the Bitmaps name would resurface again, this time for an older game. It surely made perfect sense of all the classic old Bitmaps games to revive Speedball. The game's brand of highly kinetic and accessible fun would be a no-brainer on a PlayStation that was already kind of used to chrome-tastic futuristic efforts. And hell, considering that the Bitmaps had previously made virtually no money from what was probably their most popular game, you can kinda see why they would go back to Speedball. And so, in late 2000, the original came back in 3D form, Speedball 2100. And it was a kinda mixed deal. The thing about Speedball 2100 isn't that it's bad, it's actually not, far from it. I was a lot harsher on it back when I reviewed the Speedball series as a whole, but the game is basically Speedball 2 in 3D. It's very faithful to the original, with the same arena, same teams, same general structure, same ice cream. Short of the 3D graphics, there's no wild changes here, except you can play as other teams aside from Brutal Deluxe in some modes. And the gameplay is still the same, only now you have a button for shooting and tackling, and one for jumping. It's Speedball 2, and that's hardly a bad thing. Still the same good multiplayer action, plus exciting matches with the computer. I guess that it just lacks a little something. The 3D graphics don't really match up with the 2D ones. It's just missing that little bit of pace. The game is pretty okay though. If you like Speedball, then this is perfectly good. Not a bad modernisation considering the high standards it had to live up to, and I think it's better than the faster but more gimmicky Dead Ball Zone. It's just that Speedball tends to work better in 2D, and alas, this game wasn't a particularly big seller unfortunately. As the Bitmaps output does get thinner, it's worth mentioning that they did a little something for the Games Magazine PC format called Xenon 2000 in 2000. Basically, it's a reimagining of Xenon 2, consisting of just the first level. It's okay, kinda slow. I've never been a Xenon fan, but the game's kinda missing the intensity and the wavy soundtrack, so it feels a bit more generic in many ways. All that said, considering that it's a free game on a demo CD, it's not bad. Sorta feels like something that was planned to be a full game but never got finished, and so this is where it ended up. As for the next major Bitmaps game, that would be the 3D sequel to the original Zed. In 2001 we finally got to see Zed Steel Soldiers. The original Zed is considered a fairly influential game in RTS circles. Some consider it to be the beginning of more concentrated and small group-oriented strategy games, the likes of Company of Heroes and what have you. The same can't really be said for Steel Soldiers, which in many ways has been lost to time. As it is, I wasn't able to get the original to work, but as with the original Zed, a remake is available on Steam, so we'll have to use that. It's not been received well, and I'm not sure if it's the same game that people played back in the day really. It feels kind of simple. Now I'm still useless at RTSs, so any nuances here kind of pass me by, but it doesn't feel like a complex game. Sadly, the general opinion of the game at the time seemed to be that it wasn't bad, but it felt kind of dated in 2001. In 2003, the same engine was used for a game called World War II Frontline Command, which sadly I haven't been able to find. Which is a bit of a shame considering that it is the last proper Bitmap Brothers game. So how did the Bitmap story end? There wasn't really anything spectacular about it. As they were always independent, they weren't at the mercy of a bigger company who was owning them or anything like that, nor did they sell the name out. In the end though, doing things in the Bitmap way became less and less viable. Working with other publishers always seemed to go south for them. They'd work on something, it'd be out or nearly ready, or it'd be out and successful, and then the publisher goes bust and the Bitmaps end up not getting any money. Shit like that. It just gets kind of wearying. And so the Bitmaps just kind of went their separate ways really. Not that they all left the business or anything like that. Mike Montgomery would work with John Hare for a couple of years on a company called Tower Studios that specialised in mobile games. Things went fine until, again, publishers started trying to screw them over. He spent various times chilling in contract programming, while also running the odd company here and there, such as one that specialised in green screen filming and video for games on the likes of the Wii and 360 Connect. The other main bitmaps, Steve Kelly and Eric Matthews, decided to leave the board in 1998 and also concentrate on programming. For all the core bitmaps, it seems that programming is certainly the thing they love most of all, certainly more than management, and that's reflected in their choices and their style. The Bitmap Brothers still do exist in a way, at the very least as an imprint, which has been used at various times to keep the name of some of the old bitmap games alive, although the original bitmaps are no longer involved. In particular, Speedball, which has seen multiple 3D versions over the years, all of varying quality. There's the Evolution version by Kiloton, Speedball 2 Tournament, an Xbox Live Arcade one that you can't download anymore. Honestly, 2100 is still amongst the best of them. Speedball 2 HD, which can be downloaded on Steam, isn't too bad at all, mind you. A good way to play Speedball on the cheap. The Chaos engine was also re-released on Steam a couple of years ago. While it's not been changed much at all, it's not bad if you don't have any other way of legitimately playing the Chaos engine. And of course, we've already mentioned Zed. Whether we'll see any of the other bitmap games refashioned in some way kinda remains to be seen. It would be nice to perhaps see the likes of Gods, or even Cadaver, one of Montgomery's personal favourites of the games he had a hand in, brought back to life in one form or another, but any movement on that front is pretty quiet. The most recent big bitmaps related project was indeed a book, Universe, released by Read Only Memory, which documents the story of the company in the words of the people who were there. Once again, Montgomery's decision to go ahead with the book was inspired by his glorious rivalry with John Hare after he'd done the same. Montgomery is definitely the most visible ex-bitmap, although others can certainly be found kicking around the industry. And so that's the story and games of the Bitmap Brothers. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. It's certainly been one that's requested a hell of a lot. The funny thing about it is that I've already done a lot of bitmap stuff, from series like Speedball and the Chaos engine, to related games like Turrican 3 and Sensible Soccer. I wondered if I wouldn't just be going through old ground with this one, but hopefully there was enough interesting info here to make it worthwhile. They're certainly a forthright and awesome developer, fiercely independent, never afraid to tell publishers to get stuffed, and they made games that were undoubtedly their own. An example to live by, without a doubt. Bye for now.
You might set me free. The chaos has ended. You will be remembered.
Most of the UK game studios covered here do sadly have one thing in common. Most of them exist entirely in the past tense. Sure, the folks behind the studios may still be very much active today, still doing bits in the industry, but the name itself, whether it's Gremlin, Imagine, Ultimate, Ocean, Psygnosis or whoever, is gone. Not so this time. Team 17 isn't a complete story, nor a wizened fool or anything like that. Indeed, there isn't really an ending. Over 25 years after they originally formed, they're still here, no resurrection or buyout required. Indeed, they're even somewhat thriving again. Not that there haven't been rough patches here and there, but this is a story, ultimately, of survival, of one of the longest-lived independent game studios operating today. And of course, there's lots of games with that. So here we go, the much requested video, all about Team 17. The origin of Team 17 is oddly a story of 3 separate entities, all of which bring something completely different to the table. The first of these was 17-Bit Software, a group which hailed from the demo scene and was started off by 2 men, Martin Brown and Nick Robinson, one a scenester and the other an entrepreneur. 17-Bit acted sort of as distributors in the public domain world. They'd get the best PD demos together and compile them onto discs. Some of them would be technical, some of them would be music-based, and of course, there'd be plenty of games. Gradually, 17-Bit Software started to make negotiations for some PD titles to be distributed exclusively on their compilations. Some may know the likes of Parachute Joust, for example, a little PD gem that combines the arcade classic with skydiving. And so around about 1990, what with doing stuff like this, Martin's group were kind of on the way to becoming a bona fide games publisher, even if there weren't exactly a lot of money kicking around just yet. The second piece lies with a little indie game shop in Nottingham, where late in the 80s a 16-year-old named Debbie Bestwick would start work at on break from her A-levels. She wouldn't return to finish them. Instead, she became manager of the shop, and after a year sold it to Robinson, who, along with 17-Bit, ran an independent shop chain called Microbyte, which Debbie became a part of. The theory, which seems somewhat clairvoyant now, was that they had a popular game store, so it made sense to have a publisher making and shipping games which could be sold in the Microbyte shops. All about that vertical integration, innit? And so Michael Robinson would head up this new venture with Martin Brown, aiming for something altogether bigger than 17-bit software. The final piece of the puzzle was a group of developers called Team 7. This small group was mostly made up of scenesters and people who were pulled together largely by Martin Brown, mainly programmers Andreas Tadic and Peter Tilsby, graphic artist Rico Holmes and composer Alistair Brimble, all of whom ended up together after Martin had got them a couple of little projects here and there. The first game that these guys developed together properly was a little top-down driver named Miami Chase, the inspiration for which should be kind of obvious. This game was a budget title and it was actually published by Codemasters. But before too long, Martin and Michael would pull them together under the 17-bit win. And so all the puzzle pieces were there. 17-bit software and Team 7 merged, and the result was Team 17. What of the offcuts, mind you? The original 17-bit software was actually still very much a thing in the PD world until the mid-90s, still getting together demos and games and distributing them on discs and later CDs, ultimately bowing out with the Amiga. As for the Microbyte stores, alas, they experienced problems in 1992 and ultimately wound down. By this time, however, Team 17 was fully established, with Michael Robinson as MD. Debbie Bestwick would be brought on from Microbyte to handle sales and marketing, Martin Brown would manage the most of the projects, and the majority of people who worked for Team 17, including the original Team 7 boys, did so on a freelance basis, though consistently, at least for now. And so that pretty much sets up Team 17's structure for the next decade or so. Let's have a look at some early games. We won't be able to cover all of them, but certainly most. The first game to be made by Team 7 and published by 17-bit software proper was Full Contact from 1990. There's not a lot to say about it. There's some pretty neat music and animation on the intro, but what we've got here is a fairly run-of-the-mill Yaya Kung Fu type fighting game. Not a big seller, and not a game that the Team 17 folks have a particular fondness for. The same cannot be said, however, for the next game, which was the first published under the Team 17 name proper. Alien Breed was Team 17's 1991 breakthrough, and it's got just about all the things that define their games. Cracking music, most definitely, but there's plenty of atmospherics too. And more than a lot of other studios, the presentation is very nice, but the difficulty is punishing. A monstrously hard top-down shooter in the tradition of Gauntlet, or indeed Alien Syndrome, where you have to complete tasks before taking the lift down to the next floor. It's tremendously easy to run out of ammo, keys, or indeed time, or just get killed by the deadly hordes. And you better have a good route prepared for the exit, because often you're going to need it before the whole thing self-destructs. Oh, and you can also play Pon on the computer systems if you feel like your hero doesn't have his priorities straight. Even more so than the aforementioned Alien Syndrome, the game's influence is blatant. There's no mistaking anything, from the black xenomorphs to the facehuggers to the Hadley's Hope-esque surroundings. This is Aliens through and through, to the point where you would expect a lawsuit forthwith. However, Team 17 actually did correspond with 21st Century Fox and got their approval to go ahead with the game, although not the official license. With so many games out there being inspired by the classic movie, I guess that the movie guys kind of figured out what the deal was going to be already. Anyway, the original Alien Breed is a memorable title, not the best in the franchise, but there's plenty more to come, and it was a killer Amiga app for sure, probably one of the biggest Amiga action titles that never made it to a console. Assassin is one of the first games that Team 17 published from other small developers, this time Psionic. Some people quite like this one, although it's not for me. Basically, it's a cross between Strider and Turrican with the emphasis heavily on the Capcom game. A boomerang replaces the falchion, and our hero can climb up walls and ceilings just as well as Hyrule can. It could be okay, but I couldn't ever figure out how to get past Dogs, who always seemed to kill our assassin outright despite his status as a world-leading badass. Maybe he should have brought some steaks along or something. Maybe some treats, pedigree chum. It's not a bad Strider clone and is certainly better than official attempts at the game on the Migi, but is a little ponderous. Project X is another fairly notorious Team 17 title. It's their first space shooter, a game developed by Andreas Tadic and company in Legradius tradition. The music from Alistair Brimble is excellent, as is the case with just about all of these games. You can basically take that as read for most of them, as I don't want to repeat it all the time. But the difficulty level is legendary. This is quite possibly the hardest shoot 'em up on the Amiga, and when you consider the difficulty level of Euro shmups in general, that means that this game is some serious shit. It's a half-decent game for sure, especially if you like Legradius style, but who boy it'll nail you to the frickin' cross. Good, but red flagged for experts only. Jamie Woodhouse's Quack isn't necessarily one of the most well-known Team 17 games, but damn it, it's one of the best. I love this title. Simple, quick, superbly presented and designed arcade action where you rush around collecting all the gems, pickups and keys that you need to before heading to the exit. There's little bits of puzzle and strategy along the way in this single screen title, and it definitely works in the tradition of classics such as Bubble Bobble and the like, even more so with a second player. A great game that can also be found on mobiles and the Game Boy Advance. It's a total hidden gem and no mistake. Finally in this section we've got Team 17's second attempt at a fighting game, and another one of their big hits, Body Blows. This game was a hit largely due to great timing. It beat the Amiga port of the super hot Street Fighter 2 to the shelves by a couple of months, and was helped even more when said SF2 port turned out to be utter dogshit. Body Blows is certainly better than that. It is a one-button fighting game of course, so if you're used to fighting on consoles then, you might have trouble here. It's a very tough game indeed, like most of Team 17's games from the time, and the controls can be a big part of that. The original Body Blows certainly deserved to be a hit, don't get me wrong, but it's far from my favourite Amiga fighter, and it rather pales in comparison to Elf Mania or Shadow Fighter. There is a sequel, however, which we'll get to shortly. For now though, it's time to move on to the section of this video you've all been waiting for. One thing about Team 17 on the Amiga is almost as famous as their games, something that always gets brought up without fail when they're mentioned, and that's the fight with Amiga Power. I'm not sure if there's another fight between Games Studio and Games Magazine where more punches were thrown and more bad blood was spilt than this one. It was a thunderous clash. A bit of background first. For most, Amiga Power will not require much introduction, but I'll give it one anyway. The magazine was started in 1991 in Bath by Future Publishing as their second major Amiga mag, with the first issue coming free as part of Amiga Format, Future's other big MIGI publication that certainly covered games and had its own style, but also focused on Amiga tech, whereas Amiga Power, literally next door in Future's offices, would focus solely on games. The mag is seen as a spiritual successor to Your Sinclair. It features the same irreverent humour and personal style, which is much like someone chatting informally to you about games, and it was launched by former YS editor Matt Bealby, as well as featuring several YS alumni, Stuart Campbell, Jonathan Nash, Jonathan Davis, Linda Barker, just to name a few. Amiga Power became very much noted for its honest coverage of games and pulling no punches when it came to reviewing. Operating on a 1 to 100% rating scale like most magazines, it used 50% as its median mark. A lot of other magazines tended to treat 73% as their median, as this pleased the publishers more. 73% in most mags represents mediocrity. In the eyes of AP, paraphrased from an article of theirs, it represented a special kind of mediocrity, a signifier of someone who, tasked with reviewing a game, found it to be quite bad, that they couldn't beat the first level, and that they'd had enough after 20 minutes. And yet everyone else has given the game a high score, and said someone doesn't want the publisher to get the arsake and drop advertising. And so 73% is the magic number. One that doesn't exactly appeal to somebody reading, but isn't so low that it'll piss off the publisher. With this in mind, 50% in most mags basically meant radioactive dogshit that should not be touched, whereas in AP, that stood for mediocrity, and 73%, well, that's just another number. One that represents a generally decent game on the whole. A fair few publishers did not take kindly to this philosophy, and didn't react well at all to the scores that Amiga Power would dish out. None more so than Team 17 as it happens. So did Team 17 games score badly in AP? For the most part, not really, considering their scale. The breakdown's scrolling down right here, but you can see that their most popular early games, such as Alien Breed 1, Assassin and Body Blows, all got 80% plus scores, with the latter two getting rapturous 89s. Arcade Pool, Apidia and Alien Breed 3D all managed 91, which were the best marks given to Team 17 games by AP. Still, there are some games such as Super Frog and Project X that got a harder time in AP than they did in other mags, and there are two scores which certainly do go way against the grain compared to what other mags handed out. Worms got 60%, and Alien Breed Tower Assault was savaged with 46%, the lowest score around for both games, which largely received 80s and 90s from all other mags. As popular as both games were though, these two games were not the hot point of the feud. We'll get to that later. As for Team 17, well, they certainly made no bones when it came to caring about magazines and their scores. It was a big deal for them. It should also be made clear that Team 17 had a good relationship with all other Amiga magazines, including AP's sister publication Amiga Format. But when it came to the scoring of games, AP's philosophy provoked a major disagreement that Team 17 were all too ready to be vocal about. The first punch was thrown in 1992 come the release of the 92 special edition of Alien Breed, where you can enter all manner of codes into the Intex computer machine at the start and get loads of secret messages. Most of these are either shout-outs to other mags or rude messages from the staff, but the Amiga Power one is Finished Games Only, A, which questioned Amiga Power's stated policy of only ever reviewing finished copies of games instead of going hunting for exclusives and reviewing unfinished versions of games as a result of that, or indeed using the PC version of a game as the basis of a review for the Amiga version in order to create an exclusive, a sadly all too common practice. As far as one can tell, this wasn't responded to at the time. None of these Easter eggs were printed in mags or anything. Did AP ever review unfinished games? By their admission, yes. Now, naturally, every mag will probably end up reviewing something that, unbeknownst to them, is not fully finished, although a couple of times AP did do it knowingly. Indeed, one of them is a Team 17 published game, Super Stardust, although obviously this was much later. The others were SWOS and Pinball Illusions, and in all three cases the crux of it was down to delays on the development side, the pressure of deadlines, big cover features and demo discs ready to go. Fortunately for AP's reputation, the favourable reviews each game got were backed up by excellent games, and by and large they did very much stick to their policy, probably more than most other magazines of the time. For the next couple of years, that was largely how it remained. Amiga Power reviewed Team 17 games as normal, pretty much. Team 17 did throw in a few more jibes. One favourite of theirs was to include AP journalists as named opponents in games and make them exceptionally bad, believing that they didn't spend as much time with games as they claimed to before reviewing them. However, April 1995 was when it really came to a head. Now, it's a shit time for the Amiga in general. The Commodore UK bid to try and buy out the dead parent company has just gone tits up, and unbeknownst to everyone, new owners Escom will end up burning out within 18 months and basically taking the Amiga with it. David Pleasance, along with many others, may well shed a few tears into their beers. By this time, Amiga Power were really leaning into their honesty policy, to the point of regularly criticising other Amiga mags for their coverage and their exclusives, in particular the One and Amiga Action, often referred to as Current Bun and Michael Jackson, respectively in the magazine's pages. One of the most controversial features of the mag was the Disseminator, a small box which listed various games out at the moment and compared the scores of other mags to AP's score, thus claiming that it would save you an extra £7.94p a month, which of course was the amount it would cost you to buy the One and Amiga Action together. And April 1995 wasn't a good month for Team 17 in the mag. Two releases, Top Down Racer ATR and 10-pin bowling sim Kinpin, scored 38 and 47% respectively. A few months previously, Arcade Pool had been given 61% in Amiga Power originally, until AP found that they'd accidentally reviewed an unfinished copy. A finished copy was reviewed, and the score amended to 91%. The response to all this was, well, enraged. A lot of it actually did come from another Amiga mag, Amiga Concept, which was based in France and published an utterly scathing feature on AP, accusing it of helping to kill off the Amiga with its scoring policy and saying that they didn't have the interests of the machine at heart. Team 17's reputation was heavily defended, naturally, and Marcus Dyson, a producer at Team 17 who had previously edited Amiga format, offered a rebuttal to AP's scores in which he claimed that Amiga Power possibly had something against Team 17 and that most publishers had something against Amiga Power. It didn't stop there at all. In fact, Team 17 served Amiga Power with a writ, accusing them of not doing their job properly and lying about their games, that they should communicate to them any companies or individuals whom AP had spread their lies to, and that the offending issue be purged. The proposed suit didn't get much further than that. AP and Future basically laughed it off, nothing else happened. The upshot of all of this, in the end, was that Team 17 stopped communicating with Amiga Power, full stop. They wouldn't send them their games to review. AP would still review them, of course, but they'd have to wait until the games appeared on the shelves like everybody else. More than that, they made other magazines, particularly Amiga Format, AP's next door neighbours, sign a declaration that they wouldn't let AP staff even see Team 17's new games. Jonathan Nash recalls once strolling into Amiga Format, noticing Alien Breed 3D on Steve McGill's computer, and curiously sitting down to see it before being shooed off by a somewhat upset McGill. Presumably because he didn't want to do that, but, well, there you are. As previously mentioned, Alien Breed 3D received 91% when AP eventually reviewed it. The feud would continue to the bitter end. In 1996, when Tim Norris, a man with no connection whatsoever to any of the previous spats, took over the editor's chair at AP, he tried to squash the beef and get everything going again, saying rightly that having Team 17's games covered in AP at the same time as everyone else had them was clearly of benefit to both parties. It seems as though most people at Team 17 agreed with him, except Martin Brown, who refused all contact and then withheld their latest game, The Spirus Legacy, from AP. So it goes. A few months later, Amiga Power decided, unrelated to any of this, that there wasn't much worth in covering the Amiga in its death throes, and the magazine was retired. Well, what to say about all that then, huh? It's one of those situations where, frankly, there's no winner at all. Least of all the people who buy the games, who obviously didn't know bugger all about this spat that just spiraled completely out of proportion, especially in '95. It was a very emotional time, I guess. You know that the system you love is dying and nothing's going to be done about it, but no one wants to say anything. It seems that these days people at Team 17 who are involved kinda regret the whole thing. One of Debbie Bestwick's pieces of advice to new companies is to not take it for granted, keep your feet on the ground, and don't act like a bunch of rock stars. Which might be related. Former members of Amiga Power have always rejected the notion that there was any kind of vendetta with Team 17, and it still gets brought up from time to time. The history of the whole escapade on AP2, the mag's online sequel, is particularly vicious, and when you consider the personality of people like Stuart Campbell, it's unlikely that ill feelings have truly dissipated over time. One suspects that the old AP staff and Martin Brown aren't likely to be exchanging Christmas cards anytime soon. In any case, that's this story in a nutshell. We've kind of jumped forward a couple of years. Let's pull back to 1992 or so and get into more of Team 17's Amiga games. 1993 saw the release of the next proper instalment in the Alien Breed saga, number 2, where the horror would continue. In many ways it is more of the same, still blasting aliens, taking on tasks and dying a hell of a lot. But the atmosphere is considerably more oppressive in this one, and the human sprite does look more, well, human. The game can be quite unfair at points, particularly when some task ends up giving you 10 seconds to get the hell out at the end of it, meaning you have to blow things up in a certain way that you don't really have much way of knowing beforehand. It's not exactly the most forward-thinking of sequels, but it's pretty good all the same. On a completely different note, it's time for Super Frog. Every publishing house at the time needed their quick animal platformer ready to go, and Super Frog was Team 17's, a sprightly frog who could glide along, throw his head at opponents, all sorts. And all thanks to Lucozade, the high isotope sports drink that gives him all the power he needs. Yep, it's more in-game advertising, much like Zool and Chupa Chups. Interestingly enough, Lucozade was not Team 17's initial beverage of choice. In fact, their initial beverage couldn't be further removed from it. They wanted Super Frog to be powered by Newcastle Brown Ale. No, really. He would have been the Geordie amphibian equivalent of the brown bottle from the pages of Viz. But wait, I can hear you now. A platformer with a cute frog? A game likely to be played by kids? Advertising an alcoholic beverage? Well, it's not like it wasn't on Newcastle United's shirt. It was a different time. In any case, Team 17 couldn't get the Nuki Brown licence, and so it ended up being Lucozade instead. To think what could have been. Anyway, do as Tommy Vance says, pour yourself a pint of foaming nut brown ale, and let's get into the game. Now, normally I have to say that I don't get Super Frog all that well, but I had fun with it here. It is a nice and cute game. As a platformer, it's pretty similar to Zool. It moves quite fast, you have to pick up a whole bunch of collectibles, and you have a few moves at your disposal. Still, the opening intro is probably the best thing about it, and it's even more amusing to think what it would have been like if Nuki Brown was the drink in question. Other than that, Super Frog is mostly fine. Sometimes the level layouts can be a little unfair though, and the European collect 'em up is what it is. A platform genre that's fallen far out of favour and could be considered quite annoying. This and Zool are certainly two of the best examples, but your mileage may vary. While Team 17 only published this game, it's hard to look at the best games in their library and not single out Apidia, a game made by Kaiko, a Rainbow Arts offshoot. Apidia is a stunning, justly famous Amiga game, and a very good contender for being the best European shoot 'em up of all time. Some might see that as damning with faint praise, but it's really not. It helps that it's not particularly European. Like most of Kaiko's games, there is a large Japanese influence and aesthetic running through it, and the whole thing comes off like a much better in Sector X. But above all else, there's the music, which in a career full of legendary work, might just represent Chris Hülsbeck's masterpiece, certainly a soundtrack I always keep going back to. Clearly a great game indeed. Team 17 went to the racing well a few times, with Overdrive, ATR and F-17 Challenge. Alas, the results never quite worked out that well. None of these games are bad per se, they're just kinda repetitive and end up losing out to much better direct competition. F-17 Challenge isn't a bad game, but there's no way you'd play it over Nigel Mansell or any of the Lotus games. Equally, Overdrive and particularly ATR are two fine examples of the game that I'm worst at of all, the top-down racer. And still, they're not beating supercars or micro machines. These three games weren't total washouts, and one of them did end up becoming a bit of a fire point in the Amiga Power War, and I'll say that ATR doesn't really deserve 38% in my view, and yet I'd probably only give it about 12 points more. One genre that Team 17 tried but never managed to excel in the way that, say, Gremlin did. More casual sports, on the other hand, tended to produce better results, chief amongst them being arcade pool. Top-down pool games can be kind of hit and miss, usually they're way too arcadey and there's no accuracy when it comes to knocking the ball into the pocket. But not so here. Arcade pool is classy enough to be close to a simulation while retaining quick-fire arcade sensibilities, like a much older 8-ball pool. A very good game indeed, one that was followed up in 1995 by Arcade Snooker, a special cover disc game for CU Amiga. And then there's Kinpin. Now, 10-pin bowling video games are about as niche a thing as you can get. I mean, it's less of a sport and more an excuse to go to somewhere with friends and get drunk. Kinpin is a decent one though. It actually tries to emulate the feel and drift of a lane and does an okay job. It is also funny that the same female voice who does the announcing in Alien Breed is also on the tannoy here. It's nothing but 10 pins, so your mileage may vary, but it's pretty fun in my view. And finally here there's the second Body Blows game, Body Blows Galactic from 1993. To me this is a much better game than the first. You have a much larger selection than 4 players for a start. The controls are a little better too. As much as it's only one button and a direction, it feels tighter. The problem I do have with this game, mind you, as well as a lot of other one-button fighters, is that it does often come down to purely spamming moves, usually one specific and powerful one. It can get a little samey, especially if you can catch opponents in a loop. It's okay, but Body Blows is still one of those fighting series that I'm just not a fan of. This was followed up on the CD32 by Ultimate Body Blows, which is a combination of both games into one and functions as a Mortal Kombat trilogy type game for the series. As we move into the mid-90s, the times for Team 17 are mixed. We're heading towards the end of the Amiga years and Team 17 are, like many, heading towards a crossroads. As a small independent studio, it's obviously going to take a lot to expand in preparation for making games that are suitable for the upcoming 32-bit consoles, or indeed the 3DFX powered PCs. Sales on the Amiga are variable, some games perform, some don't. The ever-present piracy ends up taking its own share of the profits. Team 17's main title, Alien Breed, is a performer, but what else is there? It seemed like the transition was going to be really damn difficult to say the least. And there were some ambitious projects that failed, in particular Kin of Thieves, an Alien Breed-esque game set in more medieval times that alas ended up cancelled. Suddenly things are worrying, but then something came out of nowhere. Andy Davidson was a man who had a game that he'd written in Blitz Basic for an Amiga format competition called Total Wormage. Basically quite like the old shareware classic Scorched Earth and Artillery, only with worms. Amiga format didn't give it much attention, it certainly didn't win, nor did it even place. Still, Andy Davidson took the game to a European trade show and presented it to Team 17's booth, where it was played by Martin Brown and Debbie Bestwick. They then met up with Andy again and played it some more, and found that they couldn't stop playing it. Ultimately, and even despite losing Andy's contact details and having to go to Amiga format to get them back, they had the game and the programmer on board, knowing that they had something, although not something that, at this late stage, could just be an Amiga title. Ultimately, Team 17 worked with Ocean through 1995 to get Worms on just about every platform going in a time period of about 6 months. Debbie Bestwick described the process as the one time that she's ever done crunch, and that it wasn't an experience that she wished to repeat. Ocean expected the game to sell about 60,000 copies. Over all platforms, the game sold millions in its first year alone, far beyond even the most optimistic expectations, and bigger than basically every other Team 17 title combined. It's a simple game, of course, one that we have covered previously. 2 or more teams of worms armed to the teeth with bazookas, shotguns, Uzis, fire punches and the like duke it out on a randomly generated landscape, and whichever team is left standing at the end wins. Unlike Scorched Earth, the worms can move around, which certainly changes the gameplay to a massive degree. The cute voices and presentation complete the package, and make worms tap into the exact same energy that Psygnosis got with Lemmings years previously. Get rid of these invertebrates, and all you have is a decent, simple strategy game that would have probably been forgotten eventually. With the worms in play though, suddenly you get a million-selling all-time classic that virtually everybody knows. Despite a few more serious bumps, including basically betting the Worms IP over a loan against sales of a game that just about managed to meet its target by the skin of its teeth, Worms has endured and has always remained at Team 17. As many titles as there has been, and rest assured we'll cover plenty of them, it has always had a purpose. In this instance, Worms saved Team 17 and assured them of a transition from the Amiga to the world beyond. Many bigger companies than them, including the one that helped publish Worms in the first place, would not survive in the new era for various reasons. But Team 17 lived on, and it was in many ways thanks to these psychotic, trigger-happy invertebrates. For now though, there's a few final Amiga titles to wrap up before we really get into Worms Mania. The Alien Breed saga continues, and it's my favourite game of the lot, Tower Assault. On the surface of it, Tower Assault does look like the same dealio. There's lots of aliens about, it's top down, and you've got to blast them. However, the game has evolved into something that was actually a little ahead of its time. Tower Assault takes place over a big colony where you can travel around freely completing tasks, as opposed to the game being split up into levels. There are lots of hidden areas and different approaches you can take, and the atmosphere has been ramped up even further. This is a dark, oppressive and very gory game, your first steps into the utterly wrecked civilian quarters being genuinely unsettling. The difficulty certainly hasn't changed, mind you. This is the hardest game in the entire series, a challenge that will require every last bit of skill you've got. It's virtually unfair, but it is so good though, a game that's worth bashing against the wall of. And you can almost paint a line to it and the open world titles to come, the GTAs and all of that. A special little title. Super Stardust was another game purely published by Team 17, and it's a belter. You probably know this, seeing as Stardust games are still a thing today. I have very fond memories of playing this, pirated by Prestige as it goes, in 1995 and being amazed as it was the best looking game I'd seen up to that point, a relentless take on asteroids that's jacked up on amphetamines. If you're bad at asteroids then naturally you'll be bad at this, but damn it's good. The developers, Housemarque, would later release an HD version of the game for the PS3 and PSP under Sony's banner in 2007. Alien Breed 3D is probably the highest profile attempt to try and bring Doom to the Amiga in the absence of the original game. Really, considering what the series was all about originally, moving it into the FPS genre seemed like a pretty logical step. The end result was a good game for the time, and for us Amiga owners who didn't have easy access to its classic. Sure, you can look at it now and be a bit gobby about the tiny window and highly pixelated graphics, but it does move well and it runs fine on a regular A1200. The sequel to this and the last Alien Breed game for over a decade was Alien Breed 3D 2: The Killing Grounds. Now this game is actually even better, and also had multiplayer via serial hookup, plus it looks nicer. It's a beast though. You need at the very least an A1200 with 4MB of RAM to run it, and that will still be kinda slow and with no weapons on display. As late a game as it is, it still might be the most advanced game of the Amiga's commercial lifespan, at least without going to the really strong power PC stuff and what have you. The Spirus Legacy is a different sort of game, an action RPG in fact. Such a thing seems welcome as you don't get a lot of them around on the Amiga, but this one doesn't really do it for me. I prefer action RPGs where you pretty much jump straight into the action, as opposed to this one where you spend ages hunting around town looking for a sword and shield. I couldn't get into this one at all, alas. And finally there's Team 17's last Amiga release, Worms the Director's Cut. This kinda bridges the gap between the first Worms and the PC sequels to come, featuring the debut of a lot of classic weapons that would become mainstays in the series, such as the Concrete Donkey, the Mad Cows, or the Holy Hand Grenade. A good looker, and worth playing if you're interested in a Worms game with those memorable weapons but with the old Amiga style, although it does cost a fair bit of money these days. Worms was very much an ideal title for Team 17 to put their flag on as it happened, especially as later instalments proved that the success of the original wasn't just a fluke. Worms 2, the first PC-only Team 17 game, introduced a more cartoony style that became the series standard for a pretty long time. There were thoughts about trying to make it for the Amiga, but ultimately the game was too powerful and it was too late for the system anyway. Worms 2 though might be the game that I've spent the most time with in the series. I've played it so much. Still, the next entry, Worms Armageddon from 1999, is probably the best of the lot. The perfect balance of turn-based strategy, outrageous weaponry and comedy is the best of what Worms represents as a classic and highly addictive multiplayer game. Worms World Party was next in 2001, and yep, still more of the same, and still very much liked by most. And of course there was all the spin-offs, the first of which was Worms Pinball in 1998. Needless to say, there would be plenty more from there, including the likes of Arkanoid-esque puzzler Worms Blast in 2001, or the later likes of Worms Crazy Golf, which is actually a pretty fun Worms-esque take on mini-golf, complete with satisfying explosions when you happen to hit any of the groundsmen. Groundsworms? Something like that. And let's not forget that the series did go 3D for a fair bit of time, starting with Worms 3D in 2002. Now if you've ever played Hogs of War, you know already that Worms had a much better chance working in 3D than Lemmings ever did, and this indeed proved to be the case. The 3D Worms games are certainly different and perhaps not as good as the 2D ones, but they definitely have their positives. The best of them for me is perhaps the most recent one, Ultimate Mayhem, which came out in 2011. It's really fun and it does certainly get that classic Hogs of War feeling, even if it doesn't have Rick Mail. This is perhaps though one of the troubles that 3D Worms faced. Gremlin may have been inspired by Team 17's work, but they ended up doing it to such a high standard even before Worms actually went 3D itself. In the end though, Worms has gone back to its 2D roots of late, starting with Reloaded in 2011. The return of Andy Davidson to the company in 2012 after a 13-year absence has perhaps helped a little there, and in more recent times has actually produced some crackers for the venerable turn-based giant. As of right now, the last and 27th title in the franchise is Worms WMD from 2016, and it's actually the best Worms game for quite some time. There's some fantastic additions such as machines to go along with things like forts that have been around for a bit, but the core gameplay still remains. It's as much of a laugh as ever. Worms is very much a title with a strong hardcore audience that'll always support it, but the game itself is still good and accessible in the same way that it always was. Of course, Team 17 did rely on Worms a lot, especially in the first decade of the century. From 1995 to 2010, they released a grand total of 16 Worms games, and there were long periods where they didn't release a whole lot else. Was it profitable to do such things? Well, it kept the company afloat for certain, particularly in more uncertain times, but in the end, despite all the spin-offs and the console versions and all of that, it wasn't a massive money spinner or anything like that. It was necessary perhaps to keep Team 17 going for a long time when they were in a tricky position. With a maximum of about 70 people working at the studio at any given time, they've always been pretty small, especially since the 2000s when studio numbers started to creep towards and then go streaking past the hundreds. The core of Team 17 have never particularly wanted to expand higher than that and take on the big boys. They're comfortable being a small studio, nor do they have the resources to hand to make anything approaching AAA titles, even back in the PS2 years. And so the PS1 and PS2 generations were all about stoking the fire of the established titles, hoping for a more favourable situation to arise where the company could really start to branch out again. It took a long time, but it ultimately did happen. For now, we'll look at other non-Worms titles from this long period. You might not have expected a sequel to Project X from Team 17, but here we are. X2 No Relief from 1996, another side-on shooter. What to say about it? Well, the graphics and the music are both really bloody good. It's always nice to see a good-looking PS shooter, and this is no exception. You'll dig this if you like Iron Handle and what have you. However, this game is hard. And that's not just a throw-out. This is damn near impossible, one of the most challenging shoot-em-ups ever made. I don't consider myself bad at shmups, and I couldn't even get past the second level. It's kind of the ultimate Euro shooter then, I guess. A good game, but it will utterly break you. On the PC front, Team 17 did do two rather obscure games in the late 90s in fairly common genres back then. There's Phoenix, which as far as space shooters go does look nice, but alas never seemed to get much traction. It does still have a website available on the internet though, where you can download songs from the soundtrack in glorious real audio. A bit more famous perhaps, though only a bit, is Night Lonely Union City Conspiracy, a cyberpunk game which stands as Team 17's only point-and-click adventure. Obviously this tiny capsule look isn't going to tell you a lot about it, but perhaps it'll be worth your time if you enjoy the likes of Blade Runner, Shadow One and all that other good stuff. There's also some late entries into fairly populated series. Army Men Major Malfunction, for example. Oh, and Leisure Suit Larry Box Office Bust. Both of these games stand as the last entry in their respective series to date, and were pretty heftily savaged in the press, especially the Larry game, which scored tons of Worst Game of 2009 awards. It wasn't good, to put it mildly. The Xbox magazine called it an astro-turd, which is quite a phrase. Perhaps we should just gloss over both of these games very quickly. I mean, they don't exactly fit in with the narrative, do they? Don't look over there. What is a little better, mind you, is the return of Alien Breed. The eternal fight against unpleasant creatures returned with an episodic trilogy of games through 2009 and 2010, and, they're pretty average, to be honest. Rather murky and brown, and kinda typical Xbox 360 generation design. You've got someone in your ear telling you to go do this, then do that, go here, pull a switch there, and so on. I can't think of many old games that were improved by having someone constantly in your ear telling you what to do, frankly. I miss the sheer isolation. They're not bad, and they do serve the purpose of bringing Team 17's original flagship title to a close, but I wouldn't pick them up unless they're on sale for very cheap. Around about 2010, with Team 17 still kicking about producing mostly Worms games for the past decade, a major change took place at the company. Finally, the trifecta broke. The last few years had started the process of Team 17 getting back to the proper, much more frequent developing they used to do, mostly through mobile games and the like, but a change was inevitable. And ultimately the change saw Michael Robinson and Martin Brown depart from the company. It seems as though the process was quite long and drawn out in some areas, although ultimately what was done was done. And so the job of leading Team 17 fell to Debbie Bestwick, now the company's CEO, who had bought out the two founders. Whereas Team 17 had been purely a developer for most of the past 15 years or so, Debbie's ultimate idea in 2012 was to take the company back to where it was, a developer-publisher hybrid, a proper software label. The developing would of course focus strongly on the evergreen Worms still, but now was the time to once again look for other potential hits. Such is the indie world today, where things have come full circle, and once again, a potentially great and massive hit can come from the hands of just one or two people. The sort of environment where Team 17 thrived once and could do so again. And it didn't take them long to find a hit. Chris Davis's The Escapists is one of those boring Kickstarter projects that never get talked about with regards to the platform, mainly because it was a success without really blowing up. It appeared in 2013 asking for £3,000 and made $7,131, 100 of which was contributed by Debbie Bestwick, who quickly got into contact, phone chats, a tour of the studio, all sorts. Because while this prison break simulator was still very bare bones, it was seen to be of value, kinda like Worms all over again. Eventually Chris signed up to the label, made the game with the help of Team 17, and the resulting 2015 title would go on to sell 1.5 million copies. Another big hit. And it's easy to see why. The game itself is unique, has wonderful retro aesthetics, and is all out brilliant. An open-ended game where ever so gradually you set up and execute a prison break, all the while following the everyday schedule of the prison. Any specky head knows The Great Escape from back in the day, surely? Well, this is the modern equivalent, and very much worth playing. It's lasted a long time too, thanks to tons of free updates, actually worthwhile DLC, tie-ins with hit show The Walking Dead, and workshop features with people able to create their own prisons for folks to bust out of. And so it continues. Team 17's most recent game is The Escapists 2 from a couple of months ago, and it's even better. Still the same great concept, but the interface and controls are that little bit more handier and streamlined. The Escapists is now undoubtedly Team 17's second biggest franchise aside from Worms, and its success could soon end up being on an even keel. And it's not the only one. Overcooked, a 2016 title by Ghost Town Games, is, hoo boy, hectic isn't even the word. You have two chefs who are tasked with mastering the art of cooking and using it to successfully feed the beast who's intent on destroying the world if he's not fed properly. And so you've got to prepare ingredients, cook them, wash the plates, serve the dishes, deal with fires. It's crazy, especially in single player. But the genius here is, of course, in cooperative play, which as an experience is something else. It's pretty much just like being in a kitchen, with all the stress replaced by hilarity and, well, probably some bickering when someone inevitably forgets to do cleanup. A fantastic game and another hit. Then there's Yooka-Laylee, a hugely successful Kickstarter project developed by Playtonic, a spiritual successor to Banjo-Kazooie made by the same people and published under the Team 17 label. Some folks like this, some don't. I've covered it a little already, but generally, for those who are really into retro-based games that lean into all aspects of the experience, good and bad, Yooka-Laylee is something for them. It's a good 3D platformer, and a very accurate 3D platformer, meaning that certainly a lot of the positives surrounding 3D platformers are there, it's just that a few of the faults are there too. Ultimately the game did do well, mind you, and we await to see if it will be followed up by any kind of sequel. And there are other smaller games. I'm quite fond of LA Cops as it goes. It didn't get too much attention, but it's a funny little strategic shooter, once again something that lends itself neatly to cooperative play. The aesthetics are very cool indeed if you like, I don't know, the Beastie Boys Sabotage video, but it's always good to bust some perps. There's Light, which is a minimalistic indie game that's based around stealth, sort of like playing Hitman but you only have the map to go on. Not a perfect game by any stretch, but the potential is there. Oh, and there was Super Frog HD, although honestly we don't talk about that an awful lot. I mean, it's not really much but Super Frog all over again, and it isn't particularly impressive in HD, or in the 2010s. Aside from that, the Team 17 library is pretty damn strong, and there's more to come. And well, there we are just about. There is no ending to this story as such because Team 17 are still going. Indeed, they're going strong. In 2016, Debbie Bestwick earned an MBE for her services to gaming, and Team 17 are arguably the longest lasting independent games company in the world. They survived where most of their peers did not. A fair bit of that may have been down to luck, although a lot was also down to a fierce need to stay independent and almost stay small. They never overreached for expansion, they didn't try a big float on the stock market, and ultimately they never needed to sell up to the big boys. Through that, along with finding the right games at the right time, they're still going, and long may they continue. Bye for now. You wanted it? And by God, now you've got it. This video was inevitable and you've requested it for a long time now, and finally I do think the time is right to tell the US Gold story. They're a publisher with, well, not exactly a good reputation. Despite the initial aim of the company to bring the best in American games over to British computers, well, in most people's eyes a lot of them aren't great, to say the least. Americans who may say only that Ocean represented the crap side of British games development have obviously never played any US Gold title. But they are a very important games company indeed, one of the biggest of the 80s and 90s in Europe, and well, their releases weren't all bad, far from it. There's lots of fun things to go through. So, let's get on with it. At various times I've described games companies as being rock and roll, mainly thanks to their flashy lifestyle or how they burnt out so fast, Imagine being the prime example of course. But Jeff Brown, the eventual boss of US Gold? Well, he actually lived it, if only for a brief time. If not for other events, there's a chance US Gold may have never existed at all, because in the 1970s Jeff Brown was in a band called Muscles, a proper blue-eyed British soul funk outfit. Here's the pictures: curly hair, opened up shirts, none more 70s. And there's Jeff Brown, right there. Principal songwriter. Now yeah, you might say, surely there's plenty of folks in games who had shitty failed bands beforehand. Well, this went further. Jeff had been playing music professionally, achieving a degree of success in the Midlands, since the 1960s. But in 1977, Muscles were on the verge of stardom. The band were a staple on the Midlands live scene, a solid tight group that was generating buzz throughout the region. And after several singles and an album that had bubbled under the charts, in the middle of 1977 they would record their mega hit, their most famous song, If It Relaxes Your Mind. If you listen to it, yeah, it sounds like a hit. A proper bouncy funk song, kind of level 42ish only a few years earlier, with a melody that immediately latches onto your brain. The sort of song that, being a bass player, I thoroughly appreciate. It was surely to be, at the very least, a top 10 single. BBC Radio 1 added it to their playlist and went so far as to name it their record of the week. As the song continued to climb up the charts, Muscles was scheduled for what would surely be their big breakthrough moment, a performance on the biggest chart show in the country, Top of the Pops. If you're performing on TOTP, well, in almost every case it's a guaranteed hit. Top 20, top 10, top 5, maybe even number 1. And from there, who knows? This was it, the big moment, the one that hundreds of thousands of bands dream of. On August the 18th, 1977, Muscles were to record their Top of the Pops performance. With one fobbed off intro from Jimmy Savile and a horde of screaming girls in front of them, their lives would be forever changed. Or not. Because of what happened on August the 16th. Elvis Presley died at the age of 42. With the death of Elvis, everything fell into absolute chaos, including the charts. Suddenly, everything about that week's Top of the Pops had to change. Everything about the charts had to change. This seismic event, the death of the biggest star in the world, had to be acknowledged, in full. And so, Muscles' scheduled appearance on Top of the Pops was cancelled. In the days following the death of the kin, virtually every Elvis single was reissued, the grief of a nation portrayed via the flooding of the higher and lower reaches of the charts, with Way Down, released a couple of weeks before his death, crashing into the top of the charts by the end of the month. If It Relaxes Your Mind, well, it disappeared from the Radio 1 playlist, never making it into the top 50, and Muscles would never get close to stardom again. It was back to the local grind. But when you've almost tasted the fruit and then had it snatched away from you, it's hard to keep going. Muscles would break up not long thereafter. Just like that, the dream was over. This is just the way that the world works. If Elvis Presley hadn't died, there may well have never been a US Gold to speak of. No one would have ever ended up buying World Cup Carnival. So how do we get from this brush with glory to US Gold? Well, not long after this, Jeff virtually gave up on music as a profession. Instead, he decided to become a maths teacher. Like many, he was curious about all of these home computers that were suddenly appearing on the market, and he soon found himself buying an Atari 800. Using his skills, he was able to learn how to program on it, and actually made a couple of simple educational games, which he tested on his pupils and then sold to a man named Phil Morris, who published them. But of course, Jeff Brown's future did not lay in game development. This is a game called Galactic Chase, a simple yet effective Galaxian clone made in America for the Atari 800 that's also notable for being the first game that Jeff Brown would distribute. Having seen it written up in an Atari magazine, he was curious and sent off for a copy. He thought it was fantastic. And it gave him a bit of an idea. He then showed the game to a buyer at Curry's, who agreed that it was excellent. Jeff said to the buyer that he was the distributor for this game in the UK and he was testing out the waters with it. Of course he wasn't, at least not yet. The man at Curry's ends up agreeing to 20 copies in a local outlet. Jeff learns it all as he goes along. He phones up Spectrum Computers in America, the publishers of the game, they work out a contract, he gets the 20 copies, sells them to Curry's, they fly off the shelf, Jeff pays the Americans within the 30 days and makes a profit. And just like that, Jeff Brown was a games distributor. This was his first, and it certainly would not be his last. Of course, Jeff was not alone. There were two people behind what would become US Gold, one being Jeff and the other being his wife, Anne Brown. Jeff was the natural salesman. Though a novice, he was quick to learn the ropes. Anne was the business mind who actually set all this up as a proper business, starting under the name of SoftCell. Still, the principle of what was to become US Gold was set up right here in the very beginning. to take the best games from America and distribute them here in the UK. The deals with Currys in particular would continue, and eventually Jeff's garage was pretty much full of software, so they needed an actual building, and then a building becomes an office becomes a warehouse, and so eventually SoftCell became Centresoft. Gradually copies of games were coming in by the pallet load, hundreds, thousands. It was still a big learning process and the new company were living very much on their wits, but it was working. Enough for extensions of credit and for the business to improve further. Still, Centresoft, while becoming a bigger and bigger company, was very much a background player. It wasn't a big brand or anything. And it was thought that in order for these imported games to really sell, that was what was going to be needed. It's better to actually get the data and duplicate the cassettes or discs yourself rather than ordering it all in from America after all. In 1984 that would all change with the formation of US Gold itself. Now the way that US Gold works is actually sort of odd, something in the middle between distributor and publisher. They're actually more akin to a record label. That was the general idea. If you look at any old US Gold game, all the labels of the company that originally made and published the game are all still there, but US Gold are now no longer reliant on ordering stock in. They duplicate the data, perhaps add in a little coding just for a logo splash, and now they could take a more forceful role in selling this software, creating the UK's biggest software club, with a reputation for all-American software. And contrary to their later reputation for lousy games, the first games that they sold over here? Bloody fantastic. The triple threat of American games that constituted US Gold's first wave of hits are all stone cold classics: Aztec Challenge, Forbidden Forest, and frickin' Beachhead. Beachhead in particular is one of the biggest selling games for the C64 over here. Originally made by Access in 1983, the multiple forms of gameplay, the graphics, well, they were just far beyond almost anything that was homegrown on the system at the time. A phenomenal effort that's still pretty fun to play now. The other titles are pretty damn good too, but Beachhead was the early flagship title for US Gold. It's one of the great early C64 titles, one that really helped to show off what the computer could do when it came to games. And there would soon be more. Much more. Seriously, if you look at the games that US Gold got released over here in the first couple of years, it's classic after classic. Allow for a brief interlude while I show you some of them.
Destroy him, my robot.
Ugh, just so many good games. So definitely a lot of credit goes to US Gold for bringing these games over here so that everybody could enjoy them, not to mention giving them all the snazzy box art and so forth that they would occasionally lack when released in the States. Of course, seeing as they aren't distributors, it doesn't make sense to go fully into them as games, although there are certainly a few examples that we'll pick up from in these early times. US Gold's philosophy was to buy tons of games, pretty much, and to let the market decide what was rubbish and what was a hit. And also there's the certain matter of an alliance with another fast-rising British software house. At this time, Jeff and Dan were still working on little resources and overdrafts. In order to keep things going, they needed a lot more. They needed stability. This would come in the form of Ocean Software. David Ward and John Woods gave them the advance they required for that stability, and in return for that, Ward and Woods took 50% of the company. What, did you think that US Gold and Ocean were rivals? Well, truthfully, I did too at one point. Fierce rivals, I always thought that. But no, US Gold and Ocean were an alliance, with Ward and Woods being part owners. It was, at this time, a mutually beneficial agreement. Who did US Gold work with then? I mean, geez, a lot of people. Epix, Access and Cosmi were amongst the companies working with them at this stage. The first two in particular would bear a lot of fruit thanks to Epix's Games series and Access's Leaderboard series. They also worked with Origin, bringing Ultimas 3 and 4 to the UK. Microprose were on the list, resulting in the likes of F-15 Strike Eagle and Kennedy Approach flying to the UK. Working with SSI would eventually bring in the D&D RPGs like Heroes of the Lance and Pool of Radiance. On the arcade side, US Gold established successful relationships with the likes of Sega and Atari. The former one in particular would last for the whole of their existence. Eventually, US Gold would sign a highly lucrative deal with LucasArts that would see them publish the likes of Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis and The Secret of Monkey Island in the UK, although that's bringing the timeline forward a bit far. So, back to the mid-80s. There's definitely a couple of games that warrant extra mention. One being a game that was in a similar vein to Beachhead and sold with that in mind, but actually goes down as quite a controversial title. 1985's Raid Over Moscow, a game where the aim, quite literally, is to drop a nuke onto the communist capital. It doesn't get much more Cold War than this. The game, probably better known as simply Raid, managed to get the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament protesting outside of US Gold stores, which obviously meant that it was a big hit regardless. And with that, the games continued. Many games, bought by US Gold, distributed by Centresoft, the company growing ever more popular. US Gold's true rivals, if anyone, were Elite. They were particularly aggrieved when Elite managed to snag the licenses for both Commando and Ghosts and Goblins from under their noses, even more so when both naturally ended up becoming massive hits. This gave US Gold the impetus to switch their focus a little. Instead of computer titles from America, they'd concentrate on coin-op conversions, with Gauntlet in particular being a massive hit. Oh, and of course there was the small matter of one particularly big license. It's so big that frankly it deserves its own chapter. This is perhaps the big reason why I wanted to do a US Gold video, because it means that I can do full coverage of the comical horror that is World Cup Carnival. And before you click away, whether you like footy games or not is utterly irrelevant. This is a story you'll want to hear. It's the one about a rapidly rising British software company very nearly torpedoing their reputation with a game that goes down as one of the stupidest releases in British computing history. So, US Gold managed to snag their first proper license to an event, that being the Mexico 1986 World Cup. Jeff Brown gets the license and gives it to US Gold's manager, Tim Chaney. At this point, especially with US Gold concentrating on arcade conversions, they now have quite a lot of games in the pipeline. Tim Chaney decides that the best thing to do is to work with Ocean on this one, reasoning out that Ocean already had a very successful and good football game, John Whitman's Matchday. A World Cup game using that engine would be fine. Ocean certainly think this to be a good idea. So cool, everything's sorted mate, nice one. Talk to us when it's done, yeah? Kush tea. Months pass. We're now in around about March of 1986, 3 months before the start of the World Cup, with tons of shit going on still on both sides. Jeff and Tim get together and wonder what's happening with the World Cup game. Jeff calls up Ocean and finds out that Ocean have done nothing. Nothing at all whatsoever. There's no game. Like, whoops. Someone obviously forgot. Having paid for this license, US Gold go into a bit of a tiz at this point. They want something out there desperately, and they send feelers out to virtually every games developer in the UK that they wanted to take a football game, any football game, and make it become their World Cup game. Working with them, overlaying the appropriate branding and such, just get something out. The only company to respond saying they'd be able to do it in the weeks available were Arctic Computing, run by Charles Cecil. Arctic had been successful right at the start of the ZX Spectrum years, producing early text adventures and the like, but the past couple of years had been a struggle for them. Still, they did have a football game, World Cup Football, originally released in 1984. They were somewhat surprised that US Gold wanted to work with them, seeing as it was common knowledge that they were with Ocean and therefore could access Matchday if needed. But still, US Gold did want to work with them, badly. And obviously they weren't going to say that Ocean had put them in the shithouse. With the time that Arctic had, there was virtually nothing that could be done. World Cup Carnival does have tacked on penalties. It also has a splash screen saying World Cup Carnival on it, and a loading screen too. And aside from that, it's the exact same game as World Cup Football from 1984. Possibly good for the time, but hopelessly outdated by 1986. Imagine, if you will, a situation where instead of FIFA 17, EA somehow releases, I don't know, FIFA 07 for the PS2 instead. That's kind of where we're at here. Arctic had done their part, but US Gold, well, they knew they had a complete duffel on their hands. World Cup Carnival was obviously a complete pile of shit, and they were going to be rightly scorched for trying to fob it off for their default price of a tenner per game. But what with spending the money for the licence, getting Arctic to chuck something out and everything, they're in way too deep to cancel the game and write it off as a loss. They don't have that much money to spare. There is little that US Gold can do except to fill the box up with fluff. Inside the box you get so many different things. Posters, fixture sheets for the World Cup, stickers, all sorts. It's all literally there to cover up a turd. The retailers screamed at US Gold over the quality of the game, and US Gold, with no intention of saying what happened, had no choice but to shout right back and ride out the storm. And of course the reviews and reaction was just utterly savage all round, even more so from those who recognised that the game itself was ancient, had nothing to do with the World Cup, and had already been frickin' released a couple of years ago. The press universally scorched them. Of course, in the same month, a lot of the same press turned around and gave their star stickers, crash smashers and what have you to US Gold, who released the C64 and Spectrum versions of Access's classic leaderboard in the same month. This is the big example of US Gold overwhelming the shelves with volume and letting the market sort it out. Of course, the licence itself still meant strong sales for World Cup Carnival, increasing the negative reaction even further. Of course, you've been seeing both the Specky and C64 versions of the game while I'm talking, and I feel that I have to stress to you that nothing you're seeing was doctored or tampered with in any way. In all instances, I was playing a regular match against the computer, no hacks, no pokes, no nothing. In the Specky version, you don't even get a net, which is frankly the least of the game's problems because most of the time when you're on the ball, there's a CPU player right on top of you, which means that both of you disappear. Simply running forward in a straight line is usually enough to get a chance at goal, mind you. In every version of the game, every other player on the pitch just stands there aside from the person who has the ball and the person who's fighting for it. So the C64 game, well, it did have nets, which is something they could lord over the Specky folks, but unfortunately this game is also horrendously broken. I've seen the CPU literally walk the ball along and then away from an open goal, several times in a match. There's also manual goalkeeping in this one, which you would have thought might help, but it's virtually impossible to save any ball that comes your way. I hesitate to say shot, as anything the computer does appears to be totally accidental. So, yeah. There's no need to even try and break anything here. This game comes broken right out of the box. Worst football game ever? Yes. Definitely. In fact, nothing else even comes close. Eventually, once the dust had settled, US Gold's excuse for the shocking quality of World Cup Carnival was that they had commissioned an anonymous programmer to write a game, but that game was terrible and there wasn't enough time to get a new game written before the Cup, so they went to Arctic. This is of course a load of bollocks. Said programmer and said game, a mythical completed if not necessarily good World Cup Carnival, do not exist, despite rumours to the contrary. US Gold rode out the storm. The volume of titles they had coming out meant that in the end, they could afford to drop this colossal stinker, and even in the same month they were releasing other titles that were good or even great. The company that didn't ride the storm, however, was Arctic. The money gained from the deal with US Gold saved their bacon, but not for long. Because, in fact, the rights to World Cup football didn't belong to them anymore. They'd been sold some time before to Prism Leisure, who immediately demanded £25,000 in compensation. With no choice but to pay up, Arctic instantly lost all the money made from the US Gold deal. World Cup Carnival was their last act. The company went bankrupt almost immediately thereafter. Charles Cecil would eventually work for US Gold as their first head of development. World Cup Carnival certainly does go down as one of the most infamous releases in the history of the UK micros, and it is absolutely the worst thing US Gold ever released. That's quite obvious. Still, the general quality of their releases was high enough for them to ride it out. Indeed, they would retain the World Cup licence in both 1990 and 1994, resulting in a couple more bad games, but at least they weren't ones that had already come out under another name. Of course, World Cup Carnival isn't something they intended to do right from the off. It wasn't malicious, just neglectful. US Gold's policy of flooding the market with their titles meant that it dropped off the radar for them, and Ocean weren't exactly unprolific themselves. It fell off for them too. It is something of a shame considering that we could have had a matchday-esque game if all had gone well. But US Gold and Ocean, despite their close relationship, was perhaps too big and too busy to work with each other in this way. The relationship kind of changes between them ever slightly at this point, with both companies occupying the fields of licensed games and arcade conversions. What was a mutually beneficial friendship becomes more of a friendly and still beneficial rivalry, particularly for Woods and Ward thanks to their 50%. While both companies never snipe at each other, they certainly don't make plans for another World Cup Carnival again. By this time, US Gold are one of the most powerful software forces in the UK. They're still allied with Ocean, and in the mid-80s Jeff Brown, through a sub-company, purchases 75% of shares in a then struggling software house by the name of Gremlin Graphics. Gremlin's fortunes would soon change dramatically as they became one of the most critically successful houses of the second half of the decade, thus creating a triple alliance that likely makes US Gold the most dominant force in British gaming. If US Gold's success benefited Ocean, Gremlin's success benefited US Gold. Jeff Brown's empire then consisted of US Gold, Gremlin and Centresoft, with Ocean as allies. A bit more would be added to this. There was an advertising company called Camel handling the PR and developing a fine relationship with Newsfield, publishers of magazines like Crash and Zap64. There was also a collaboration between Centresoft and Ocean that resulted in another label, the Hit Squad. This label, designed for budget re-releases of games, first made its mark with the They Sold a Million series of compilations of previous hits. Ocean and US Gold both had plenty to choose from, and they would add even more through purchasing the catalogue of games made by Ultimate Play the Game alongside that name, and also getting another label called Software Projects in on the act. And so the first They Sold a Million compilation consisted of Ocean's Daley Thompson's Decathlon, US Gold's Beachhead, Ultimate Saberwolf, and Software Project's Jet Set Willy. The compilation itself would, indeed, sell 1 million, as would all the other entries in the series. So what are the management at US Gold like anyway? Truthfully, they're a bunch of pretty tough nuts. Jeff Brown is the charisma, the man up front, and he happily shows it. He makes a point of driving to meetings, any meetings, in his prized Ferrari Testarossa, but he does have a real keen eye for games that are eventually going to be successful. The manager Tim Chaney is the muscle. Tim made his original bones working at Jack Tramiel's Commodore, and he took lessons from the Don all too well, becoming a firm believer in the business's war psyche. Hired by the Browns for being the only person who managed to stiff them on a deal while he was still at Commodore, Chaney is a respected manager and a vicious attack dog to be set on retailers and press as and when needed. These qualities served US Gold very well when they tried to make something out of the shit that was World Cup Carnival. But Tim is nothing compared to the true muscle, Anne Brown, possibly the most feared woman in 1980s British gaming. Jeff is the face, Tim is the muscle, and Anne is the brains. Instrumental in the success of the company at every step, the force in all of the meetings, unfazed by everybody, and vengeful when anyone gets the drop on the company or even says a shitty word about them. Particularly Elite, who the Browns literally wanted to crush, never forgetting how they managed to snatch those Commando and Ghosts and Goblins licenses from them. They actively wondered why anyone even bothered to directly compete with them. The financial rewards were one thing, but US Gold really did care about being number one and having the best and most popular games. For now, they were right up there. Despite the intensity of things and certain rivalries developing, Tim Chaney against Gremlins head Ian Stewart for example, the ship was steady. Of course, the big thing was the special relationship, that one between US Gold and Ocean. With relations still cordial despite World Cup Carnival and both companies operating in the same space, they worked together in order to basically dominate the arcade conversion marketplace for themselves, with agreements on who handled what from what company. This is why, for example, you very rarely saw Ocean publish games by Sega or Capcom. These licenses were almost always done by US Gold. Likewise, Ocean would handle conversions of games by, say, Taito or Nintendo. You may look at a duffel of a conversion like, say, US Gold's OutRun and wonder if it would be better if Ocean had handled it, but it would have never happened because Ocean never put a bid in for such a license. And it worked. What with this, agreements also extending to release dates, and controlling Centresoft, now easily the biggest distribution warehouse of games in the UK, the two companies dominated the arcade conversion market. Sure, the odd license may get snatched away here and there by Elite, Activision or Grand Slam, but US Gold and Ocean were so much bigger that they weren't even really a threat to them. The only real issue was, as ever, how much Ocean benefited from US Gold's success, and they couldn't ever really get away from that. For US Gold, arcade conversions were now very much where the money was at. The original practice of importing games in from America, while successful, had a ceiling. That being the moment when the American companies thought that they didn't actually need to have US Gold acting as their middleman and just went ahead and started to do it all themselves. Microprose were the first to do this, severing their relationship with US Gold and establishing a UK branch in the late 80s. Geez, covering US Gold can get quite tiring. There's just so many different entities to look at. Anyway, they did have quite a few developers who they would use on a regular basis for all of these arcade conversions and the like. With business going on as normal, let's have a look at some of them. This can also serve to wrap up the computer years of the company. It's time to start getting into the consoles. Probe Software were one of the bigger developers around in the late 80s, and they worked with plenty of people. You can find their name on games for Ocean, Infogrames, Virgin, all sorts, and they would be prolific in the 16-bit era too. They did several games for US Gold, all of which vary in quality somewhat. The best of their conversions is probably Solomon's Key, which as a puzzle game really works quite well on the computers. However, they did also do some quite duff ones. Probe's name was on the quite famously lackluster OutRun port, and it was also on another quite badly reviewed port for Wygar, though this game does have its fans. However, it wasn't all bad. A couple of pretty great coders were on their staff, and they did some better games for another, more mysterious label in the US Gold Empire, one which we'll get to shortly. I should quickly mention Cinsoft, although we're kinda past them already. Cinsoft were US Gold's first extra label, and it wouldn't be their last. They only published games in 1984, and only 4 of them at that. 2 of them are amongst US Gold's best releases, the fantastic isometric flying and bombing sim Blue Max, and an outstanding conversion of Sega's early arcade smash Zaxxon. You also have Fort Apocalypse and Doughboy, a pair of kind of fun but decidedly hard shooters, of which Fort Apocalypse is the better one. 3 of the 4 games were originally made by Synapse Studios in America, and Zaxxon was ported to the C64 by them, which is why Cinsoft is often regarded as merely an alternate name for said company, which isn't true, but presumably this label's creation was part of a partnership between the two companies that ended up being kinda short-lived. Tiertex were one of US Gold's biggest developers, and one that Jeff Brown himself had a stake in, so naturally a lot of work came their way. People have wondered why Tiertex got so much work with US Gold, and well, that's the obvious reason why. Anyway, they started making games for US Gold in 1986, and would continue to do so right up to the end. Their first few games are quite good actually, fine computer versions of both 720 Degrees and Rollin' Thunder to kick things off. Alas, these were followed up by an atrocious port of Street Fighter, and an even worse fighting game that was based off of their shitty port of Street Fighter, The Human Killing Machine. And so it would continue. Tiertex became infamous for largely very poor arcade ports, such as Strider, Thunderblade and Road Blasters. Of course, seeing as how these guys would be US Gold's main developers in the 16-bit years, we're not done with them yet. What's also worthy of note is that of all these developers and labels, Tiertex are the only one that still exists today as a developer of mobile and handheld games. We've looked briefly at Ocean's Hit Squad thanks to the Centresoft connection, but US Gold naturally had a budget reissue label all of their own, and that was, of course, Kix. Kix releases were typified by their trellis backgrounds and yellow text boxes that made them stand out almost as much as their Hit Squad's reissues. Kix didn't have quite as much software and agreements at their disposal as Hit Squad had early on. Short of US Gold re-releases, Kix largely re-released Gremlin games and a few others from the likes of, say, Palace Software. Still, that was plenty enough considering how vast US Gold's library was, and their library of other titles would increase over the years, resulting in the release of over 100 budget reissue titles on the label. Although Hit Squad is arguably the more famous budget label, Kix would outlast them and be used by US Gold right up to the end, and even a couple of years beyond that. Creative Materials were quite a short-lived company, only lasting for a couple of years. Mainly they're famous for the work of their star coder, a guy by the name of Richard Applin. Applin, through his work with Creative Materials and other companies, was famous for some strong work on arcade conversions, such as, for example, managing to get the proper arcade sprites into Final Fight on the Amiga. Such things are a good example of his work and represent Creative Materials at their best. And then of course there's eSWAT on the Spectrum, one that Applin didn't work on, and is quite possibly the worst game we'll see in this whole video, and that's actually including World Cup Carnival. Another brief little thing, what's the deal with Jeff Brown's sub-company? The one that he used for his stake in Gremlin and possibly Tiertex too? Well, there's nothing mysterious about it or even interesting really, but this company was formed in 1984 and called Woodward Brown Holdings after originally being called Five Fast. There's not much at all to be said about this company to be honest until 1991 when the name is changed again to Centre Gold Limited, but we'll come to that when we get there. Emerald Software were another short-lived company based out of Ireland, and in fact there's only one game that they're really famous for working with US Gold on, but it's a doozy, the computer version of Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. The Sega games based around this movie are rather strange in general, but the computer versions are, well, completely bats. This utterly obtuse top-down thing just doesn't work at all. US Gold were worried about the low quality of the game and it getting past Michael Jackson's lawyers, but eventually the game was accepted unseen and sold okay, despite reviews that could charitably be described as mixed. Several people from Emerald went on to long careers in the industry, including one Paul McLaughlin, who would move to the UK and establish a long working relationship with one Peter Molyneux, becoming head of art for Bullfrog, Lionhead and 22 Cans. I already covered Ultimate Play the game in their own video, so this is basically just a recap. US Gold bought Ultimate from the Stamper Brothers in 1985 and continued to use the label. It's worth mentioning again as the games they released were all originals and constitute some of the few totally original non-licensed, non-conversion, non-import games that the company released around this time. Unfortunately, games like Martianoids, Bubbler, Cyber One and Pentagram were all utter crap and totally unworthy of the Ultimate name. My guess is that US Gold would have liked to use the label more as both an original games brand and a way to perhaps sneak some titles away from that Ocean agreement, but it never gathered much momentum and, to be honest, US Gold figured they were better off just re-releasing Ultimate's older, more successful games as budget titles. In any case, the Stamper's new company, Rare, bought back the Ultimate name and its catalogue in 1988. Software Creations did a couple of games for US Gold early on, mainly free Capcom conversions, all of which, unlike most of US Gold's Capcom conversions, were excellent. There's Bionic Commando for one. Sure, it's the much less liked arcade version, but it's a fully featured port, even on the Spectrum, and it has absolutely fantastic music. Then there's LED Storm, a somewhat obscure car shoot-'em-up, but one that's worth playing, particularly on the Spectrum thanks to the absolutely ungodly music that makes the occasionally weak AY chip sound like the C64 SID chip. Even better is Ghouls and Ghosts, another full port for the computers, a total overachiever on the Spectrum, and again, fantastic music. There's a good reason for this. Software Creations mainly consisted of programmer Mike Follin and his brother, arguably the greatest video game music composer of all goddamn time, Tim Follin. You may know these guys better from NES games such as Silver Surfer and Solstice. For the most part, while their games vary wildly in quality, they're worth it just for the soundtracks alone. And finally, there's the mysterious case of Go. This isn't another developer. Go was a very short-lived label under the US Gold Empire. You can find the Go label mostly on conversions of Capcom games, usually on less famous games like the conversions of the aforementioned Bionic Commando, Black Tiger, Sidearms, and Tiger Road, among several others. Certainly not the most famous Capcom games, but the conversions are of varying and occasionally decent quality. A fair few of them were handled by either Probe or Software Creations, and honestly, they're usually better than the conversions of the more famous Capcom games. There's also the brilliantly animated Trantor, a game by David Perry. No, not that one, but the one also responsible for the likes of Savage and other games that really tested out the old micros, and who would later become very successful indeed. Go existed primarily as a way to get some games away from US Gold, and away from the 50% share that Ocean had in the company. However, it didn't take too long for Ward and Woods to twig on that the label was basically US Gold under a different name, and the threat of a lawsuit pretty much put the kibosh on Go for good. Most of the games were reissued by US Gold's primary budget label, Kix, or even, in the case of Trantor, virtually chucked away on magazine cover tapes. The label was briefly revived in 1993 and used for the Spectrum conversion of Street Fighter II: The World Warrior. In a vain attempt to try and get in as many US Gold games as possible, I'm going to spend time going through a few of the more intriguing ones of the hundreds that they released. Of course, it's mostly arcade ports and the like, but there are some oddities. Also some other really good ones. And yes, some terrible ones. How's about a bit of the Blue Bomber to start us off? Yes, US Gold released a Mega Man game. Not on the Spectrum or anything like that, but on the Game Gear. This is an odd little thing from 1995 that's described as a hybrid between Mega Man's 4 and 5 and is not exactly well liked. Graphically it looks fine enough to me, although people more familiar with the series than me can certainly point out inaccuracies, but it plays fine. However, the big problem with the game is that there are no continues, which considering the difficulty level of your typical Mega Man game is pretty damn unfair. Anyone who is looking to assemble a complete US Gold collection for whatever ungodly reason will find Mega Man to be the big stopgap. The game is valued at around £100 just for the cart alone, and nearly £400 complete, making it by far the most expensive Game Gear game, full stop. US Gold's take on Strider has been mentioned by me, hell, even reviewed 4 years ago. Over here it's known as Strider 2, and in the US it's called Strider Returns. Either way, it has nothing to do with the later Capcom arcade game. This game, by Tiertex, is still an absolute stinker with the very worst Euro platformer traits, from randomly spawning enemies to endless leaps of faith and utter garbage design. It does have a bit where Strider, Hinjo, not Hiryu, not even Hien, turns into a robot, or at least it does on the home computer versions, which is where the Mega Drive game came from, but no matter what you choose to play this game on, it's horrendous. The best thing about the whole package is the Mega Drive version's insanely clear voice samples, which was kind of a rarity on the system.
I have you now.
And of course we can't not mention US Gold's Outrun game on the Master System, the red-headed stepchild of Sega's driving franchise. Outrun Europa is just incredibly odd. I mean, the game puts you on a bike, and then in the second level, it puts you on a jet ski. There's some odd plot thing, you punch bikers out a la Road Rash, dodge the police, try to shoot down helicopters. The thing is, it's a perfectly decent game, but it's just not Outrun at all. Even before you add in the bike, it has nothing to do with the series. It smacks of being a different game entirely that the Outrun name was stuck on at the end in the belief it would sell better. This may well have happened, but people would have hardly expected something like this. But then Sega had already made what's essentially a Chase HQ clone called Battle Outrun before this game. There's still Outrun 2019 to come. So, this was just an odd chapter in the franchise's history. By the way, Outrun Europa is a Probe Software title, and if you can get past the name then it's worth playing. Now there may never be a bigger perceived difference of quality in a partnership than the one between US Gold and LucasArts, and it produced some strange fruit, mostly Star Wars based. Star Wars for the Game Gear is intriguing. It's a lot like the more famous NES game, but with its own quirks and quite a linear retelling of A New Hope that touches on most things in the movie, even down to a section at the start where you play as Princess Leia that I don't believe is in any other version. This game actually isn't all that bad either, especially not if you're used to the original game's eccentricities. Oh, and guess what? It's by Tiertex. Not a bad showing from them this time around as it goes. Okay, this is one of the strangest games I have ever seen. Charlie Chaplin. And for a change it's the DOS version. Released in 1988 by notoriously bad developers Canvas, it's best described as a slapstick simulator where you help Charlie film various scenes for his slapstick movies. This seems to consist entirely of going around and kicking things, including this dog.
You kicked my dog today, you bastard fuck.
Sorry, had to. Anyway, you kick things, you avoid being hit, or do you? Isn't the little tramp supposed to be knocked on his ass? Wouldn't that make for a good scene? Who knows? This is one of those games where I have absolutely no idea on what to actually do, and I don't think anyone else who's played it has a clue either. One of the weirdest video games of the 1980s. Presumably sales were rubbish and mooted Buster Keaton or Harold Lloyd based sequels were scrapped. Sad, eh? I couldn't let this section go by without a mention of the Hurricanes, as it's quite an unlikely licensed game. What, don't you remember the Hurricanes? A very bad cartoon series based around the adventures of a football team that ran for a couple of years in the mid-90s, it somehow snagged itself a game. Published by US Gold and released for the Mega Drive in 1994, in Europe only. It's about the most generic licensed platformer you can find in most regards, with the only odd thing about it being that you attack with a football using lethal passes and headshot lobs to beat your enemies into a bloody pulp. This is kind of fun even if most of the game isn't, and hey, no matter what happens, your ball will always be replaced. Equally, I can't not throw in at least one more proper football game. As mentioned, US Gold kept the World Cup license even after the debacle that was World Cup Carnival. And one look at the game Tiertex chucked out for the 1994 World Cup will make you wish they hadn't. Holy crap, this is one stinker of a footy game, best described as a crippled version of Kick-Off. Much like the tournament itself, this game is seemingly dedicated to nothing but making football seem like the most god-awful and unfun thing on the entire planet. Is it as bad as World Cup Carnival? Well, no, of course not. But it is pretty miserable regardless. Okay, one more game here. I had to look at this one just for the title. Killed Until Dead. Made by Artec and published by US Gold for the Amstrad and Speccy, it's an adventure mystery type game where you have to stop one of 5 famous mystery writers from being killed to bits. Do you know the old 70s Neil Simon comedy Murder by Death? This is basically a video game adaptation of said film, only without the official license. Seeing as it's an adventure game, I can't really say a whole lot about it in this brief capsule, though it seems half decent to me, but the title alone makes it worth a look. You may also want to listen to the classic Motorhead song Killed by Death while playing this game, you know, just for the kicks of it. As we enter the 90s, US Gold slowly undergo a period of transition. Tim Chaney leaves US Gold in 1989 purely because he wishes to do his own thing and ends up forming Tech Magic. Jeff and Ann Brown, while still working together professionally, ultimately divorced due to a total lack of work-life separation. The relationship between US Gold and Sega greatly improves, with US Gold ultimately agreeing to become the first European publisher of Master System games. And US Gold as a company have to seriously think about the increased cost of production for the cartridge games that are coming, both for the Mega Drive and Master System. The solution is preparing to float the company on the stock exchange, which means a consolidation of all that they own. Finally, the special relationship between US Gold and Ocean comes to an end, as US Gold buy back Ward & Wood's shares in the company for £8 million. It's been a fruitful relationship and a powerful alliance, but US Gold gave Ocean far too much for what they offered in return, especially seeing as it wasn't that long before they didn't need Ocean's funding at all. While it was important in their infancy, now, well, it kinda represented a great deal of money lost. US Gold also free both Gremlin and Tiertex from their grasp, giving them options to buy back their stakes, which they do, although Tiertex will largely continue to work with the brand new form. Both companies will benefit greatly from what is to come. As we get further into the 16-bit age, US Gold finally make an overture to the States, opening up a win there. Most people across the pond won't have seen anything of US Gold at all until the 1990s come round, but they certainly make an impact when they do arrive. And all of this serves to increase the potential value the company has to prospective shareholders come flotation. Finally, Centresoft and US Gold are together, and they are now purchased, along with smaller companies under the empire, by what was Woodford Brown Holdings, which then becomes Centregold. Martin Savage, previously the financial director, rises to become one of the most powerful people in the company, ultimately becoming the new managing director. A value of £50 million is assigned to Centregold, with over 8 million shares up for grabs. And they sold like wildfire. There were over 100 million applications for shares from the city. US Gold were, in fact, the first computer games company to go public in the UK, and their arrival generated a lot of buzz, even if it also introduced even more pressure. And of course, going public made Jeff and Dan Brown millions of pounds. So in the early 90s, again, despite the reputation for poor games that they enjoy now, business for US Gold is still as good as ever. Being an important publisher for Master System games certainly bore fruit, as the system enjoyed a glorious long life in Europe that it didn't get anywhere else. They'd got a bit better with licensors, with the Olympics being probably their most successful one. Of course, back in the 80s they'd been the UK distributor for all of Epix's games, all of which were greatly successful. And when Epix shut its doors in 1989, US Gold soldiered on, getting an official Summer and Winter Olympics license and giving the games to Tiertex. Olympic Gold for the Mega Drive is, to be honest, as good an athletics game as you'll find beyond the likes of the Track and Field series, and is full of button-mashy goodness. There was also the odd successful film license, such as Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, another Tiertex title and, not exactly a good one, but a game that would sell bucket loads over several formats, making a few £1,000,000 for US Gold. Critically average, but commercially a huge hit, and a very well remembered Mega Drive title in Europe. And as far as critical and commercial hits go, well, it's easy to forget that US Gold published Flashback. Jeff Brown went to Delphine one day, saw the rotoscoping on a game they didn't have a name for yet, was utterly blown away and literally bought it then and there. The eventual result being one of the best games of the entire 16-bit era. And yeah, there's a few shite games too. Strider 2, otherwise known as Strider Returns, is quite simply abominable, either on the home computers or on the Mega Drive. We've covered this one before. The home computer version of Street Fighter 2 also goes down as a total stinker, a game that just didn't belong on the Amiga, let alone the C64 or Spectrum. The Godfather, a huge multi-disc game for the Amiga, was another license that totally missed the mark. It looks great, but that can't hide the bog-standard side-scroller that lies within. Still, US Gold had their hand in the release of so many games, either distributing a version here and there, re-releasing them on kicks, all sorts. It's tricky to sort it all out into good and bad. Over the course of 12 years, US Gold are credited on 346 individual titles on Moby Games, and that's not counting all the many different versions of said games. That's double the amount of games that Psygnosis were credited on in their lifetime. Stock market flotation was a huge success for US Gold, making the company an absolute ton of money, and also marking the first time that US Gold as a publishing arm's profit exceeded that of Centresoft. More games were thrown out there, from the utterly shocking likes of Winter Olympics Lilyhammer 94 and World Cup USA 94, to the quite good if brutally hard likes of The Incredible Hulk. In October of 1994, plans were made to expand further, with the acquisition of Core Design for around £5 million. Core at the time were a very well respected company with a lot of critical hits, but they weren't doing quite as well commercially. Still, Jeff Brown's eye is in pretty great shape. A lot of his decision to acquire Core was based on seeing the early prototypes on a certain game that one Toby Gard was heading up, involving a lady heroine's jumps and rolls around a bunch of ancient tombs. A bold move, to be sure. And then there was the formation of an in-house studio, Silicon Dreams, created in preparation for the 32-bit era to come. At this stage, all looked pretty damn great for US Gold. They were a huge force in European gaming, and they just got bigger and bigger. Dominant in the 8-bit era, they were right up at the top in the 16-bits too. They were now working with Nintendo as well, publishing games on the SNES without any effect to their Mega Drive interests. They had the publishing know-how, and they certainly had the distribution. Everything looked pretty good. And then things started to turn a little sour. The first hit came when LucasArts ended their working relationship with US Gold in 1994. Even more brutally, LucasArts switched allegiance to Virgin Interactive, who were at the time headed up by CEO Tim Chaney. The last game US Gold published for them was X-Wing, so that meant they missed out on quite a few really successful titles that were coming. It wasn't a critical hit to lose LucasArts, but it did kind of set a ball rolling. As Jeff Brown relates in the story of US Gold, they did rest on their laurels a bit at the time, resulting in the loss of LucasArts. If US Gold weren't a public company, this wouldn't have hurt as much, but losing LucasArts had a predictably bad effect on their stock. By this stage, buyers were also holding off on their stock to see what US Gold were going to do in the 32-bit market. It was kind of an awkward situation for Jeff Brown to be in, and one that he didn't particularly feel suited to. US Gold's final releases are mostly pretty simple affairs, neither bad nor good, and often made with Silicon Dreams. Their relationship with Axis did continue right to the end though, meaning that they published the Lynx series of golf games right up to the CD version of Lynx 386. There were other American imports of varying quality, games ranging from William Shatner's Tech War to Duke Nukem 3D. Not bad for being the second to last game the company would have a hand in. As far as more homegrown titles go, there were the last 16-bit games, things like Fever Pitch Soccer and Izzy's Quest for the Olympic Rings. In the end, US Gold were only involved in a handful of 32-bit titles: Johnny Bazooka Tone, Olympic Games Atlanta 1996, and Olympic Soccer. The final game that they would ever publish is actually one I'm kinda fond of: Olympic Summer Games for the Mega Drive, a fairly decent athletics game with kinda decent graphics for the system. Not quite as good as Olympic Gold, but not bad either. At this stage, things aren't exactly in freefall, but the ground is pretty shaky, and Jeff kinda feels that it's time to get out. He's not suited to being a CEO of a public company, and, well, hell, he's already a very rich man. There are people who want more and will work their arse off to get it, and some who, at a certain level, feel that enough's enough and don't want the intensity required to go even higher, that it's time to cash in those chips and return to normality. Jeff Brown is obviously the latter. A big buyer would soon come his way, in the form of Eidos Interactive. Eidos had started out in 1990 as a video compression company, and they would become one of the biggest UK games companies around. But they didn't even start in games at all until 1995, when Eidos Interactive was formed and the company bought Domark. And then, in 1996, they would buy Centre Gold for approximately £18 million, the whole lot, including the US Gold label, Centresoft, Silicon Dreams, and Core Design. Jeff had absolutely no regrets whatsoever. By the end, he was quite happy to cash in. But he wasn't done yet. There is a good epilogue. Jeff Brown became Eidos's worldwide publishing director and immediately started convincing Eidos to get fully behind the game that Core were working on, the one that had convinced him to buy Core Design: Tomb Raider. They did, and that turned out pretty well. Millions upon millions of copies sold, the PlayStation Superstar, and so forth. It was good work. It established Eidos as one of the biggest games companies in Europe virtually on its own, and it was Jeff Brown's final major bow in the industry. He resigned his post at Eidos not long thereafter, not happy with such a big corporate role. Eidos dropped the US Gold label for good and ended up selling Centresoft to Activision in 1997, where it remains to this day, still the biggest distribution centre of video games and accessories in the country. So it's certainly a good ending. We're kind of used to seeing lengthy falls, a long period where the company just gradually loses relevance, ends up becoming a shell of its former self and so forth. In the case of US Gold, they saw that the winds were changing and got out while the going was still okay, making a ton of cash. Jeff Brown did very well out of the games industry, very well indeed, as did Anne. And Jeff still does. Now based in the States, he's taken little roles here and there in management for various games studios, the sort of stuff that he's happy doing, and he's still playing music. How to sum up US Gold then? I think most people would have expected me to do a lot more bashing of the company than I have done, because yes, they are certainly notorious for the odd bad game here and there, and there is the perception today that almost all of their games were of poor quality, largely thanks to the Capcom arcade conversions. But, well, no. US Gold as a whole were not a bad company. There's obviously some isolated incidents that deserve attention, but that doesn't represent their whole output. They were instrumental in getting a lot, and I really do mean a lot, of good games over here to the UK. Jeff Brown, a guy who I can't help but like, had a great eye for games that were going to be really good and successful. He showed that with Flashback and Tomb Raider. It's difficult. US Gold are almost purely a publisher, not a hybrid in the way that Ocean or Psygnosis were. And being a publisher and distributor is usually a thankless task, one where you're only really noticed by people like me if you're releasing a lot of shite. And they did, primarily because they released a lot of games. You certainly can't fault them on quantity, but they reasoned that the market would decide what was good and what wasn't, and the good would sell. And usually they were right to do that. In the end, there was a great drive to be successful, to be at the top of the charts both critically and commercially. And well, they did succeed. And unlike a lot of the companies we've covered, they got out while the sun was still shining. So I'm sorry to disappoint folks, but if you want a brilliant example of a highly successful British games company, one that generally kept up a decent standard of releases and didn't end up devouring itself, look no further than US Gold, one of the most dominant software forces in Europe, and one where I can truly say that the impact of what they did is still being felt in the industry to this day. Bye for now. It's been a little while since I've done a proper history of a company type video. I've almost forgotten how to do them, which is worrying. This is already somewhat different in that we're not covering a bunch of Brits today. Instead, we've got some Americans. But they are a company that's been requested a lot and frequently, and a double bill of requests to cover two of their games kind of forced the issue. Now I could just give you separate reviews of The King of Chicago and Wins, but nah, let's push the boat out. Let's look at Cinemaware themselves, a company that dared to be different, was ahead of its time in many ways, tried to push the boundaries of gaming in an era when everything was up for grabs, and ultimately fell short. This should be interesting. Cinemaware's principal founder, Bob Jacob, got his start in the industry in 1984. A Chicago native who moved cross-country to California, he worked as an agent for companies such as Epix and Activision, selling C64 games to them. A nice, cushy way of existing, but Bob had something of a vision. He felt that games as they weren't quite cutting it, that they lacked mass appeal. The programmers who largely created games weren't exactly in touch with what the people at large wanted, and at the time this would have been an important question to ask as we headed into the North American video game crash. The inspiration for Cinemaware came from the platform that they would largely spend their whole time in the business working for, the Amiga. When Bob got his hands on an early A1000, it changed things for him. This was the machine that could make Bob's vision for games a reality. Bob Jacob himself admittedly wasn't much of a gamer, but he was something of a movie buff, and he believed that in order for computer games to have mass appeal, they needed to be like movies. They needed to tell stories, as movies did, to have character, snappy scripts, high visual fidelity. That was the key. He wasn't the only one to think this way, of course. He was following in the line of Rick Dyer, creator of Dragon's Lair. Elsewhere in California, Tom Zito was busy creating the projects that were to be the flagship of Hasbro's never-released Control vision that we know so well today. Still, Jacob's vision at this point didn't necessarily involve live actors or hiring Don Bluth. Jacob's cinematic spin on gaming even goes back to his pre-Cinemaware job. As an agent working as a go-between with small developers and big publishers, he fancied himself not unlike a classic Hollywood agent of old, essentially selling products. He was an entrepreneur who felt that he had a set of skills in selling that a lot of small developers lacked, even if the games themselves often didn't appeal to him. He's on record as saying that even the most story-driven games of the early days, Infocom's text adventures and what have you, did not appeal to him. But the Amiga did. A chance meeting with a prototype Amiga at the Officers of Ireland, a small dev he was working on selling a paint program with, would change his career path completely. It is interesting to compare Jacob's approach with another company who took a lot of inspiration from cinema at the time, the Trip Hawkins-led Electronic Arts. EA's influence from cinema was less direct and more an aesthetic thing in that they also wished to establish themselves as a studio that would take games to a new level, through treating their own devs as celebrities and serious creators, embracing games as an art form in all areas right down to their LP-style packaging, and indeed through their very name itself. They were artists, not developers. But they did this while still utterly dedicating themselves to games as their medium, while Jacob had a more simple approach. He reasoned logically that the Amiga, with a proposed price point of $2,000, would not cater to the existing gaming market, that of teenagers. Bluntly put, the machine would be too expensive for them, or more accurately, too expensive for their parents. He wished to create games for adults, mid-30s professionals who were much likelier to buy the machine, and in terms of games would want something enriching but not overly complex or taxing that would show the system off and create an experience more in line with the movies he loved so much. Trip and Bob were after similar goals, yet the approaches were entirely different. Still, EA would create another tool that would give Cinemaware the ability to achieve their vision: good old deluxe paint. After gathering up funding from the best sources that he knew, Mormon doctors in Utah apparently, Cinemaware were officially formed in 1986, signed a distribution deal with Mindscape, and set to work on their first 4 games, with the deadline to go gold on all of them by October of the same year. Cinemaware would use various people for the creation of said games: Sculptured Software, a developer that Jacob already had bonds with through his agent job, and 2 individual talents, Doug Sharp and Bill Williams, who had cut their teeth on various games for the Atari 8-bit and the Macintosh, amongst others. While the Amiga had been Bob's main source of inspiration, he chose to hedge his bets when it came to the multitude of 68,000-based computers that were now on the market. Sculptured were to create a game inspired by medieval costume epics for the Amiga, and a Cold War-inspired sci-fi thriller for the Atari ST. Doug was handling a game inspired by 1930s mobster flicks for the Macintosh, and Bill's game for the Amiga would be their take on the Ray Harryhausen-style fantasy adventure. If all went well with these games, then Cinemaware could start thinking about ports. For once, all of the games that I described did end up coming out, and they are actually all important, at least in one way or another, but none more so than their first game. The first year or so of the Amiga was, if you were a fan of games, pretty thin on the ground. There just wasn't a whole lot out there that flexed the system's muscle, not much that wasn't already available on the 8-bit computers even. Bob's instinct was indeed correct. The Amiga was too expensive for the kids to flock to, and so for the first year of the machine's existence there wasn't much of a games market to speak of at all. But Bob and Cinemaware had an idea that would change all that. An epic game based on the old swashbuckling dramas of medieval England, where dashing men with moustaches took part in joust tournaments, saved fair maidens, and beat off the Norman hordes from the shores of England. Building block-wise, as an idea initially from Bob and thrashed out into detail by Kellen Beck, it was Risk, but localised entirely in England, and as a game, it would become Defender of the Crown. The importance of Defender of the Crown to the Amiga as a gaming platform quite frankly cannot be overstated. This was the first true killer app that the system had. When it was demoed in September of 1986, it sent the crowds absolutely wild. It was seen as the future of games. It created the gaming market on the Amiga. It's estimated that a couple of months after its release in November, over a quarter of the Amiga's then around 100,000 strong user base had bought Defender of the Crown, and Lord knows how many others possessed pirated copies. If you add them to the mix, then perhaps 3/4 of the base had it, if not more. The game was utterly ubiquitous. Bob Jacobs' instincts had been proven right. There was indeed a market for the games that he wished to make, and in that sense Defender of the Crown was an utter triumph. But hoo boy, a gut and a half was busted to make it possible. The dev cycle for Defender of the Crown was infamously brutal. As mentioned, Cinemaware had no less than 4 68,000 based games to deliver to Mindscape by October, and outsourcing was required. One part of the equation for Defender of the Crown was one of the most talented men working on the machine, Jim Sachs. His pictures were shared on discs throughout the Amiga scene. In 1986 he was arguably the Amiga's best painter, and he was the art director on Defender of the Crown. The majority of the scenes in the game are his, and that's by far the most memorable part of the game today. The quality of the artwork was and is phenomenal. It's still an extraordinarily pretty game. The other part was taking all of this fantastic art that Jim and his team were doing and sending it to Sculptured Software, who were using it to make a game. And this was where things went badly wrong. Sculptured, who were also working on SDI for the Atari ST, were way out of their depth when confronted with the 68,000 chip. They were spread thin, and put bluntly, when Bob came to visit them in the summer, he saw that virtually nothing had been done, and we are about 4 months out from release. It's a crisis. And so Bob hires Cinemaware's first internal employee, John Cutter. Cutter, a highly important figure in the company, was in this first instance a problem solver. It was decided that Defender of the Crown would be taken off Sculptured completely, and that they would keep SDI, but under Cutter's strict supervision. Cinemaware turned to no less a figure than Robert J. McCall, one of the literal inventors and designers of the Amiga, he of the Boyne demo and designer of the Amiga's GUI, to take the art and whatever Sculptured had done, and in 3 months turn it into a working game. To be fair, it's not a bad choice, especially when they kind of understated just how much of a mess the game was at that point. Mikhail worked day and night, virtually 20 hours for 3 months straight to knock the game together. It nearly killed him. He was so beaten, wrecked and pissed off by the experience that ultimately he didn't even want a credit for it. Jim Sachs too, who worked equally as hard, was also a bit peeved and felt underpaid for his efforts. Without these two, there would be no Defender of the Crown. Neither man worked with the company again. The game itself, as released on the Amiga, is of course visually a total beaut. As a game itself, it's clearly unfinished and only just working. The strategy element is as basic and simple as it gets, the jousting and sword fighting minigames completely incomprehensible, and the siege catapult scene only marginally better. It's not good, at all. Crucially, however, it is a short experience. A game is only going to last an hour or so. For that time, the art is enough to carry the game through by the skin of its teeth. It gives you a certain feeling. It's pure Hollywood, of course. You enlist the help of Robin Hood, you save a fair maiden, and you even have a love scene, which needless to say became one of the principal selling points for the game, and you perform other acts of derring-do for the country. It's not history, but it sure is Hollywood. Defender of the Crown is brilliant in presentation, even if it's less so in gameplay. Some would accuse it of being all style and no substance, a criticism that would stick with Cinemaware throughout their whole history, but its importance is undeniable. And of course, the success on the Amiga meant that it got plenty of ports, almost all of which, due to having more time spent on them that wasn't a total death crunch, are better games than the Amiga original. The Atari ST version of the game is undoubtedly leagues better than the Amiga version for a start. The console version on the NES would wipe the floor with it. There were other 8-bit versions too, such as a lovingly made one for the C64, even a Spectrum version which ended up unreleased. It was most certainly a sensation no matter which platform it was on, and for all the criticism that can be levelled towards it as a game, Cinemaware would have been nothing without it. The Amiga would become an incredible gaming platform with this game as the jump-off, for better or worse. It was groundbreaking. But what of the other 3 titles that the company had in the pipeline? All the other 3 games arrived with varying degrees of success, but when it comes to sales and influence, Doug Sharp's The King of Chicago is undoubtedly second behind Defender. It is also probably my favourite Cinemaware game, a take on the adventure that's way more influential than it's often given credit for. The whole thing was created by Doug Sharp solo for the most part, although he also partnered with a screenwriter to build the story. Even the rather odd Waxwork characters from the original Macintosh version were Sharp's. He created them when not working on the code, and they would be digitised from there. You play as Pinky, in a Chicago that needs a kin. The previous one, Al Capone, has just been busted for tax evasion. This is Pinky's story, and you choose his path through a whole bunch of choices. Do you whack the old man? Bribe the mayor? Treat your girlfriend nice? There's choices everywhere. Even if you end up in the chair, you can choose to be regretful or defiant. You're Pinky right to the bitter end. Some dismiss Chicago as simply an electronic choose-your-own-adventure book. However, it's a lot more complex than that. A CYOA usually has at best a couple paths to victory. They're pretty linear. There's a lot more variation here. Multiple paths and outcomes for most every choice you make, decided through a mix of all the other choices you've made and a hint of sheer randomness. Plus, the way the game is laid out, a series of character-driven vignettes, means that win or lose, every game does feel like a story. This means that Chicago is very repeatable, unlike a lot of other Cinemaware titles. A complete playthrough may only represent as little as 20% of the game. You'll exhaust it eventually, but it will take some time. It's really quite good at creating its mood too. The dialogue feels authentic to 30s gangster movies. You can picture Cagney, Raft, Robinson. It works very well. There are faults, of course. The minigames are typically simplistic and annoying. The strategy element where you manage the crew's money feels inconsequential and is especially annoying in the Mac version where it takes the form of a long conversation. However, as is often the case, ports improve matters. The Amiga port removes the convo and replaces it with a simple sheet, while also removing the potato heads and providing beautifully crafted portraits instead. It's the ideal way to play. The game rightly sold well, and for me it's one of the best realisations of Cinemaware's ideal, better than Defender of the Crown. Sinbad and the Throne of the Falcon for the Amiga is another one-man job, that of Bill Williams. And seriously, that's not a joke. He didn't just code the game, he did the graphics, the music, the design, the lot. In some parts it looks, well, kind of dodgy. Defender of the Crown, this is not, but the Herculean effort can certainly be appreciated. The game itself is largely a series of minigames with some navigation thrown in. The minigames are of varying quality, and there's all the things that you would expect by now. Raunchy love scene, big fights against Cyclops and so on. It's not awful, although not a standout. Like all of these early Cinemaware games, the ports were better by virtue of having more people work on them with more time to spare. Don't play this on the Amiga, play this on the Atari ST, or even the C64. That said, being the original does count for something. Unless, that is, your poor old SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, not even the not that well known Sega game which is still way better known than this one. Cinemaware didn't release that many games, and yet this one is utterly obscure. Why? Well, bluntly put, it's terrible. This was the second game that Sculptured Software was supposed to be working on, and as previously mentioned, it turned out they were way out of their depth with coding for the 68000. They finished this one, but only under John Cutter's strict leadership, and I say finished, but that's debatable. In SDI, you pretty much do two things. A dead simple space shooter section, and then a bit of tower defense as you use your satellites to spot rogue Soviet nukes and shoot them down. That's it. There's another little shooter section where you rescue your friend on the other side, which results in the by now utterly cliched Cinemaware love scene, but that's your lot. Oddly, what's lacking from this Cinemaware game is, well, the cinema. You don't find much of those cutscenes or narrative drive here, and when the ending reveals that the whole thing was a movie, one can't help but be utterly underwhelmed. It's a bad game. I sensed that a lot more was planned for it, but in the end, well, that contract had to be fulfilled. I'd say the ports of this are better, but SDI didn't travel much at all beyond the ST. An Amiga port and that's that. It's rightly left in the bin, in all honesty. And so Cinemaware had released their first 4 games, by the skin of their teeth. At least 2 of them, Defender of the Crown in particular, take a place as highly influential classics that helped put forward new design philosophies. One important thing to note about Cinemaware is that they were trying to create a workflow that was cross-platform but would essentially allow anyone to create a Cinemaware game. This is most evident on the framework that Doug Sharp created for King of Chicago, which isn't all that dissimilar to more modern things like Twine that try the same thing and essentially make it so that you don't need a coding background in order to create games. Cinemaware were trying to do this sort of thing in the 80s already, folks. Cinemaware had done their tour of the 68,000 platforms, and by the end of it they had figured out where they wanted to go. And so, we moved to their second wave. Bob Jacob and company thought, perhaps correctly, that while they'd managed to achieve their goals with Mindscape, it was not without a great deal of stress, panic, and ultimately broken relationships. What they'd done was still halfway between, acting as a middleman. They worked with a publisher, but then outsourced their development. This approach, for the most part, would no longer do for Cinemaware. It was quickly decided that they needed to build a strong in-house team. They'd certainly made a bit of money from the Mindscape deal and the huge success of Defender of the Crown, so it would go back into building a highly advanced, cross-platform dev suite that, at one brief point, was the envy of just about everyone. John Cutter, Cinemaware employee number 1, and Bob Jacobs' consigliere, would be rewarded for his excellent fire extinguishing abilities by receiving the keys to this particular kingdom. It was also decided that they needed to make a firm commitment to one platform in particular, which was a no-brainer. Cinemaware had even managed to have a hit on the Amiga in America, no mean feat considering the tiny user base for the machine, but already their games were becoming hugely popular in Europe, especially as they worked with, good old Mirrorsoft. Mirrorsoft don't often get credit as a big publishing house, probably thanks to how spectacularly they imploded. But the Mirrorsoft connection was a big deal, and sales for Cinemaware games sold in Europe through them quickly eclipsed all North American numbers. Anyway, the foundation of the Cinemaware ideal started with the Amiga, and for Bob Jacob, the company's future laid there too. So, we move to the definitive titles of Cinemaware's second wave. Now you may wonder why, with Cinemaware's obvious love of movies, they didn't end up doing more licensed games than they did. They only did one, which we will see in this wave. As it turned out, Cinemaware were rather iffy about the current state of licensed games. Seeing that studios were given little time and resources to churn out games based on what was to be in the cinema with rather mixed results, they decided not to be a part of that. Cinemaware were still very much catering for what they felt was an older audience, and the simple side-scrollers that most licensed games in those days were wasn't compatible with that. They weren't an action studio, they needed a bit more time to make these digestible and short but highly narrative-driven games. So in the end, they decided that their dabbling with licenses would come without such strict timeframes. They would go for older products that still perhaps had some kind of name value. The first of these was, of course, The Three Stooges. We'll talk more about the game in a bit, but why Larry, Curly and Moe? A lot of it, again, came down to good old Bob. He loved The Three Stooges. All the pies, the slaps. There was a certain appeal to their classic vaudeville comedy, and Bob loved it. A lot of others at Cinemaware didn't, including John Cutter, who thought the idea was a non-starter, but Bob would get the license and push ahead with it anyway. The Three Stooges weren't exactly a big name by the late 80s, but they were recognisable. The same can't really be said for the second licence they pursued, Commando Cody. This character had starred in a collection of early 50s cinematic serials by Republic that were later syndicated and shown on TV. He was a rocket man, donning a jetpack and taking on villains such as, say, an evil dictator who's taken control of the moon. Successful at the time, but incredibly obscure by the late 80s. But as it turned out, Cinemaware were actually on the edge of a zeitgeist here. Someone had decided that these B-movie darlings, the jetpack-donning rocket men, were due a revival. Unwittingly, they walked into a Hollywood shark pit. They started negotiating for the Commando Cody license thinking it would be easy pickings, only to find themselves quickly eclipsed by no less a figure than Steven Spielberg, who gobbled up the license with the aim of making a Commando Cody movie. No matter, Cinemaware then went to the licensees for a homage to those old B-movies, Le Rocketeer comic strip. Unfortunately, Disney had got there first. Le Rocketeer was also the reason why Spielberg never actually ended up doing anything with his Commando Cody license, and the upshot of it all was a rather humdrum and underperforming 1991 Disney movie, complete with lousy licensed game of course. And so, Cinemaware didn't have their Rocketman license, but still, they would create their own homage with an original character, and the end result of all of this was Bob Jacobs' most favourite Cinemaware game, Rocket Ranger. The story of Rocket Ranger is not unlike those Commando Cody serials. It takes place in an alternate history where the Nazis won World War II and they rule a planet through controlling the moon. You, a US Army scientist, have taken it upon yourself to don your rocket suit and radium pistol and combat the Nazi menace single-handedly, ultimately flying to the moon and destroying their lunarium mines. And of course there's fascist aliens too. As with most Cinemaware titles, the initial idea for all of this came from Bob, and the design would be taken by others. But for him in particular, this one was a passion project, and the Cinemaware game he was by far the closest with. It is a great concept indeed. The love for the inspiration is clear in every last bit of Rocket Ranger. It's packed full of different games and sections that constantly change the experience up, it's long and beefy enough to warrant a repeat performance. In many ways, it's good. And yet it's undone by one thing, the monstrous, completely unfair difficulty. It's full of many things you absolutely have to get right to the letter. If you don't, it's an immediate game over. The ultra-harsh copy protection that runs throughout the game, where you have to use a code wheel in order to figure out the exact fuel you need to fly to a specific destination, is one factor. It helped to combat the piracy that was by this point having an impact on their game's sales, but who buoyed it up the difficulty considerably. I know I often say that games are difficult, but this is one where pretty much everyone agrees. It's brutal. This difficulty was, in many ways, a response to those who'd said that Cinemaware games were too easy, and they perhaps went a bit too far in the other direction. Still, it was another hit for the company. It was certainly a game that you would probably end up spending quite a lot of time with, especially if you were to actually beat it. And how many games allow you to have a boxing match with an alien? It is a pretty crazy project to be sure. Some again may find the game's ports to be a better option. Perhaps even the NES port is a more accessible beast, although still a toughie. It is probably the best realised of all the Cinemaware NES ports though, better than Defender of the Crown, and certainly better than the next game, The Three Stooges. The best thing about The Three Stooges really is that intro. You know, the one that makes you think that Cinemaware have sent you the one game until Larry, Curly and Moe make their appearance and sort things out. It is one of the legit funniest jokes in gaming, and one of the best things that Cinemaware ever did. The game itself, well, it doesn't really live up to that. It's a selection of minigames that have been whipped together into a board game style, with all the antics that you would expect. Everything here is based on scenes from classic Three Stooges films. Again, it's clearly a labour of love. Even the game's manual is essentially a massive appreciation and history of the comedy trio, much more than it is, you know, a description of how to play the game. This was pretty common with Cinemaware. They loved to be flowery, and it's easy to appreciate the loving nature of their manuals in a world where physical manuals are, well, basically dead. The minigames, gameplay-wise, are variable in quality to say the least. Some of them work okay, others are awful. What is good at the very least is the presentation. Utterly immaculate, beautifully done portraits of these three comedy legends. It's a total looker, without a doubt. Even if the lengthy intros to a lot of these minigames do get old pretty bloody quickly. There are some really good things to say about it, and, well, it is a good use of the license. I mean, what else could you use a license like this for? It probably wouldn't have been any better if it had been, like, a side-scroller or something. In fact, it would have just been worse. It is memorable, at least. Larry's widow apparently loved it and even wept when Cinemaware showed it to her. And in the end, the instincts worked again. The Three Stooges was actually another seller. Some say it was even their second best-selling game, after Defender of the Crown. On balance, it was certainly a worthy excursion for what would turn out to be the only licensed game that Cinemaware would ever produce. Now, we have a few other titles to look at from the second wave before we get to the third and final one. The highlight of these being Cinemaware's quite intriguing take on the sports game, along with a couple other really quite obscure titles such as, say, Lords of the Rising Sun. This game tried to be Defender of the Crown again, only beefed up, better, and with a feudal Japan setting as you try to pacify Japan by controlling either one of the great warlords Yoshitsune and Yoritomo. There's perhaps more features here than in Defender of the Crown, and some decent music too, plus the art's not bad. It is, again, damn difficult in some parts though. Those with cracked versions will no doubt fondly remember the ninja attack parts where you die in one hit, and it does have that air of inscrutability. It's not utterly simple like Defender, but it isn't the most understandable game. In Cinemaware retrospectives, this is often put right down there with SDI. I don't think that's necessarily fair, but it isn't a highlight. However, one person is on record as having taken notice. Mike Simpson, director of Creative Assembly, used the game as inspiration for the original Shogun Total War, first game in the almighty RTS series. Even more obscure from a Cinemaware perspective perhaps, is the Crystal. This is an odd one. Truthfully, the game doesn't have an awful lot to do with them, but they did release it in America. You can actually find Cinemaware branding on quite a few titles you wouldn't expect, including the original Speedball, which was distributed in North America under their Spotlight software imprint. No doubt Speedball came from their great relationship with Mirrorsoft, although there are other odd ducks here such as Federation of Free Traders and Stormlord. Anyway, the Crystal was seen as close enough in spirit to Cinemaware's games to actually get a full release under the Cinemaware banner, complete with its famously awful North American box art. The game itself was originally developed by Fish and Chip Games, published in the UK by Addictive, and featured an introductory narration from no less a figure than the legendary astronomer and games master himself, Sir Patrick Moore. The game is undoubtedly one of the strangest concoctions a UK developer came up with in the 80s, and I can imagine that American audiences were utterly perplexed by it. It's an action-adventure sort of game where you play as a space pirate named Dancis Frake, really, who goes around planets, tries to figure out what the flow is, gets into fights, and blows up aliens in his spaceship complete with old-school wheel rudder. Most of the game is spent collecting items, solving puzzles, chatting, the usual trial and error. Some say it has a LucasArts influence, but actually it's closest in spirit and design to the classic 8-bit gargoyle adventures such as Tir Na Nog and Dundalak. The art style has a brilliant campiness to it, like gloriously cheap, televised British sci-fi, an episode of McCoy-era Doctor Who mixed with Robin of Sherwood. The game itself, alas, doesn't do that brilliant style justice. It's rather different from the usual Cinemaware fare, although I can kind of see why they'd choose to release it under their branding. But it didn't set the world on fire, that's for sure. However, there is a series of games that might be better known, their TV Sports series. Both TV Sports Football and TV Sports Basketball are pretty well known and regarded, and in some areas not even just for their fancy presentation, which, as was the Cinemaware way, tried to emulate a TV broadcast. TV Sports Football is a perfectly capable American football sim for the time. It's not quite of the level of the Madden that was to come, but it's not bad at all, and it will give you a fun little time on the gridiron. TV Sports Basketball is definitely the one I enjoy more, however. It's 1990, so pretty late in Cinemaware's life, but it really gets the presentation to a T. It's rather unique in that it completely eschews the mid-court game to go pretty much straight to a showdown in the paint every time, but despite all the Cinemaware bells and whistles, it retains a pretty fast pace because of this. I'm generally not very good at serious basketball games, but this is still a good effort indeed, and well praised at the time. Now, these two TV sports games were developed and released by Cinemaware, without a doubt. There's another that we will cover later, but if you're European, you'll be aware of two more: TV Sports Baseball and TV Sports Boxing. Both of these were released after the demise of the company, but obviously they need to be cleared up. TV Sports Baseball was a home computer port of Bo Jackson Baseball, a 1990 NES game by Beam and Data East. Mindscape handled the Amiga port in 1992, and because they'd managed to get the TV Sports name from the end of Cinemaware, more on that later of course, they used the name in Europe because of it and Cinemaware's value. TV Sports Boxing from 1991 is a similar story. This was published by Data East in the US and Mindscape in Europe, and Americans know it as ABC Wide World Sports of Boxing. Now you might think this game looks familiar for other reasons. Well, the game was developed by Malibu, who were also known as Acme Interactive. A year later, they would work with Sega and develop Evander Holyfield's Real Deal Boxing for the Mega Drive, a smoother version of the same game. Mystery solved. As for the games, well, neither are bad representations of their sport, but they're also not really Cinemaware games, so having cleared them, we can move on. It's now time to start telling the story of how Cinemaware went down, before moving to their last two, and most would say greatest, games. So there is one other thing to clear up. You know when I said that The Three Stooges was the only licensed game that Cinemaware were involved in? That was kind of a fib. There is another, and it is by far the most obscure game that they ever created. This is Disney's Cartoon Arcade, a game for, the Interactive Vision. I'm sure you're wondering just what on earth an Interactive Vision is, and I doubt I will get a chance to talk about it again on the channel, so I'm going to tell you. The Interactive Vision, or to give it its full title, the Viewmaster Interactive Vision, was a VCR game system, much like Hasbro's doomed Control Vision or the Action Max. It worked using the vertical blank interval, the brief nanosecond of time in the middle of a frame where there's a scintilla of blank space, during which, it was discovered, it was possible to place code. The system itself was 8-bit and went between the TV and VCR, allowing games to be superimposed onto video images. Cinemaware got behind the project and developed the pack-in game for the system, Disney's Cartoon Arcade, one of only 7 titles released for it. The absolute linearity of a VHS tape kinda limited the system to games like this, children's games that are about as simplistic as it gets. This weird looking system was sold for $120 and, well, obviously it sank like a stone. In fact, the 5,000 units the machine sold make it one of the worst selling consoles, in the loosest possible sense, of all time. Dave Riordan, one of the most important employees of Cinemaware's later years, said that it failed because it was marketed too much as a toy. Despite heavyweight licenses such as Disney, The Muppets and Sesame Street, it failed. But perhaps the rather cheap and perplexing design was a factor too. It looks beyond daft, like something you'd use to keep your VCR on life support. It was clearly a dog that wasn't going to hunt, and the result certainly wasn't a success for anyone, certainly not Cinemaware. So why on earth did Cinemaware choose to get behind this absolute dog of a system? It was, in many ways, born out of frustration. By this stage, Cinemaware were the Amiga's premier developers without a shadow of a doubt, and yet the platform was a constant source of irritation for them. Why? Well, as is often the case with bad decisions and the Amiga, the answer lies with Commodore and one of the stupidest mistakes they made when it came to the platform. Now, as we all know, one could write an entire tome on Commodore's Amiga-related mistakes. Indeed, a man by the name of Brian Bagnall has done. But one of their most egregious ones was utterly ignoring, for the longest time, the arrival of the CD-ROM. When Microsoft introduced the CD-ROM format in 1986, Amiga users were utterly beside themselves. Their platform was surely poised to take full advantage of the new format. Just imagine the Amiga's standards of graphics and sound on a format that could truly take advantage of it, a 650MB CD as opposed to a 1MB floppy disk. If Commodore had been an early adopter of the CD-ROM format for the Amiga, who knows what would have happened with the machine? It could have been an absolute game changer. And what did they do? They chose to completely ignore the format. Commodore didn't even release a CD-ROM based system, the CD-TV, until 1991, a long time after the horse had bolted. This act of sheer stupidity, a classic from the Commodore boardroom's litany of technological ignorance, was damn near criminal, a bull-headed, penny-pinching lack of respect for a clear future. And you wonder why, in the deathbed vigil, the Westchester engineers burned an effigy of Mehdi Ali and pissed on his ashes? Many people inside and outside of Commodore were no doubt frustrated by their complete and utter lack of effort, resolve, brains and so forth, and Bob Jacob was one of them. The CD-ROM format was perfect for what Cinemaware wanted to do. It was the format that they really needed to shine. One of the hard walls of Cinemaware, which they only broke once, was to stick to 2 floppy disks. They felt that endless disk swapping would destroy the immersive, interactive experience they were going for. They used the most advanced compression techniques going to get as much on those disks as they could, but they could only do so much. And so, confronted by Commodore's broken boardroom, they looked for alternatives. The premier Amiga developer wished to move away. If you wish for an example of the potential Cinemaware had on CD, take a look at the rather obscure CD-ROM version of Defender of the Crown, the second CD-ROM game ever to be released. High quality VGA pictures, an orchestral soundtrack, voice acting. This is what Cinemaware wanted, their dream. But so far, here in 1989, the CD-ROM had no mass appeal yet, and certainly not much of a user base. Only the utterly rich could afford a CD-ROM drive for their already expensive PCs, and there was no console out in the West yet to take the mantle. Cinemaware looked to Philips and the CDI, but endless delays meant that pretty soon they got bored with waiting. Ultimately, they thought that they found the answer in Japan, and made a deal over there. This was the deal that in many ways would end up killing the company. But we aren't going to talk about it yet. First we have to talk about the game that for many is Cinemaware's greatest achievement. What you see in It Came From the Desert, in many ways, is the honing of Cinemaware's craft. Considering how much they did, it's hard to believe it all came in such a short time. Defender of the Crown was just 4 years previous to this, when they still didn't really have much of an in-house development program at all. And now, well, they were pretty high up the totem pole. Right at the time when they disintegrated, they were starting to find a consistent and very high quality as more highly talented people walked through their doors. Guys like David Riordan. Dave Riordan's career is quite interesting. He started out in the 60s and 70s as a songwriter and actually co-wrote a Billboard #1 hit, Sugarloaf's Green-Eyed Lady. After a successful songwriting career, he found himself at Lucasfilm, and from there he started working on games with Ballblazer as his first co-production. And then, after that, to Cinemaware, where he would design and direct this classic title, the ultimate Cinemaware horror B-movie, and a game where they undoubtedly got everything right. It Came From the Desert essentially brings together everything that Cinemaware had done to that point and wraps it up in one neat package. The minigames here, whether it's a knife fight with one of the residents or shooting the antennae off of giant ants, are excellent. The game is a very non-linear experience indeed that can be repeated plenty of times with all sorts of differences in the story, whether you lose or fail. And the story and narrative drive is the strongest yet. A glorious B-movie homage to the likes of Lem it may well be, but what starts out as hokey and full of humour becomes ever more panicked and terrifying as the 15 days wear on and the ant invasion becomes ever greater. While Bob Jacob had often been the ideas man for Cinemaware's games, he took a back seat to Riordan on this one. Not that he had trouble creating a game that was fully in the Cinemaware spirit. It was a lengthy and expensive one, a year's production, which was quite a dev cycle back in those days, but the story of Dr. Greg Bradley's attempts to save lizard breath from the ant colony was worth it. Even the harshest critics of Cinemaware, the ones who had always accused them of being all mouth and no trousers, mostly admitted that with this one, they'd got the mix of gameplay and narrative spot on. The game feels like the start of a new wave for the company that would have seen them get better and better as the 90s wore on. Little did anyone really know that it would end up being a part of their final flourish. But we'll get to that. Aside from a DOS version, there's a couple of other things that are worthy of mention. It Came From the Desert did get a sort of sequel, an expansion pack called It Came From the Desert 2, Antheads. This is the closest Cinemaware came to making a proper sequel in their lifetime. There were other releases such as Defender of the Crown 2 for the CD-TV, but they were basically enhanced versions of the original. Antheads uses the same assets and code as the original to tell another story in Lizard Breath, expanding on the possible existence of a second Queen Ant and colony, with the help of an ex-army officer named Brick, who must also try to prove that radiation can be fatal. This is the 1950s after all, and atomic bomb testers were a little ignorant of such facts back then. It's a solid companion piece to the original game. Pretty damn rare seeing as it was only available through mail order, although there's obviously various ways of playing it nowadays. Another interesting little curio is the Mega Drive version of the game, which was supposed to be released in 1990 but never made it to the shelves. For whatever reason, Electronic Arts decided against its release. It's completely different to the original. The immersive, cinematic adventure is now a top-down shooter where you play as Buzz, a pest control worker who has the incredible ability to fashion flamethrowers, lasers, and freeway shots out of trash. You use this to save the town from the ants and save your dad, while working under a strict time limit. It is pretty challenging, but it's also very short. The game is done and dusted in literally quarter of an hour, and apparently the ROM image of the game is basically finished. In the end, well, it is something of a dumbing down of the original, isn't it? It's not all that good, and its failure to arrive isn't exactly a big loss. And lastly, well, there's another very important version of the game that we need to talk about. The version of the game that features live video. Yes, Cinemaware ultimately made the decision, as you might have expected, to hire some actors, get the cameras out, and start filming proper. They are a Los Angeles company, after all, so what would you expect? However, we need a new chapter for this version, because in a roundabout way, It Came From the Desert, despite being a great success, was also the game that helped to kill Cinemaware. How so? Let us get into the fall. The Amiga version of Desert was seen as the test one for what was to come, a Dave Riordan directed version that would use full motion video. The CD-ROM release of Defender of the Crown had also been a part of the process as a way of proving the formula. Riordan was optimistic about the possibilities of FMV, especially when it came to attracting big Hollywood names. It was 1990, we were right in the middle of the VHS boom when you could find tapes on just about anything, and Riordan said that if the commercial potential of interactive video could be proven, then the big names would come. That said, they didn't try to recruit any for this game, instead relying on a group of unknowns. Not exactly hard to find such people where they were, of course. While nothing went wrong with the shooting for the FMV as such, the crew at Cinemaware were able to direct the actors and handle the primitive green screening just fine, the simple fact remains that shooting a film like this costs money. Hiring actors, crew, sound stages and all that cost thousands of dollars every single day. By the time that shooting was finished, Cinemaware had spent a big chunk of the profits they'd made on all their games on this FMV version of It Came From the Desert, enough to put them in a financially precarious position indeed. It's not like they could sit on this, they had to get it out. Which was a big problem. By now we're in March 1990, and there still isn't much in the way of commercial options for CD-based consoles. The Philips CDI console and format, which Cinemaware had previously been banking on, was still over a year and a half away from arrival, the likes of the Mega CD and the 3DO didn't exist at all, and the arrival of CD-ROM drives into PCs was still slow. Cinemaware are in a tough position. They've made this game, but where do they put it? And then, apparently, came salvation. From Japan, in the form of NEC. It's fair to say that the TurboGrafx 16, which was already out in America by this point, hadn't exactly set the US on fire. It launched virtually in direct competition with the Sega Genesis in the States, and this 16-bit skirmish was over quickly, with NEC's system utterly routed. But they did have a potential ace up their sleeve, the CD-ROM capability. The Japanese PC Engine already had a CD-ROM drive add-on, it had been there for over a year. The TurboGrafx CD, when it launched in the West, would be the first console to take full advantage of the new format, and NEC planned to release it in August of 1990. And Cinemaware? Well, they needed something quickly. On paper, it was too good an option to pass up. Cinemaware basically went all in on the TurboGrafx CD. NEC bought 20% of the company, and they got exclusivity on the CD version of It Came From the Desert. A big deal indeed. So what happened next? You can probably guess. No, the TurboGrafx CD did not turn things around for NEC. It launched at $399 with no packing game for a start. It completely failed to make any impact against both Nintendo's crown or the resurgent Sega. By the time the Mega CD was announced, the TurboGrafx CD wasn't even seen as a competitor to it. People were probably looking more at whatever Nintendo were planning to do with Sony, or distant projects like the 3DO, or literally anything other than the CD system that was already out there because it was that much of a failure. Quite simply, the TurboGrafx CD was a bomb, and the Japanese mother base were angered enough to fire the entire team responsible for its launch and the Cinemaware deal. And what was it came from the desert on the TG-CD in the end? It was awful. The base TG16 itself wasn't even close to being as powerful as an Amiga. It wasn't even a 68,000 based system, meaning that the game itself had to be somewhat simplified. And the FMV capabilities? Atrocious. Not even close to what Cinemaware wanted, because the system was not capable. And because take-up on the system had been so low, Cinemaware couldn't sell this game that they'd spent so much money on. Not anywhere, and not on any other system because NEC had exclusivity. Other portions of the NEC deal didn't help either, such as throwing away money on TG16 ports of TV Sports Football and TV Sports Basketball, and indeed making the one TV sports game we haven't talked about yet, TV Sports Hockey, a TurboGrafx 16 exclusive. Shockingly, considering how Cinemaware probably felt about the NEC deal by this point, the game wasn't very good. Compared to the rest of the TV sports games, let alone the usual standard of Cinemaware game, it was an absolute nothing generic sports sim. Every single thing that the company did with NEC left them in more debt, and their position, suddenly, was untenable. At the start of 1991, Cinemaware were over $1 million in the red. Bob Jacob tried desperately to find a buyer for the company, courting people both in the world of cinema, Columbia Pictures, and the world of games, Electronic Arts, but to no avail. There was no way back. The company was in its death throes. By the summer of 1991, they were liquidated. A great deal of the assets they left behind were acquired by Mirrorsoft and Mindscape. Various projects, including more TV Sports Football and a spy thriller known as The Enemy Within, disappeared into the void. After a rollercoaster 5 years in which they'd tried their damnedest to redefine gaming as everyone knew it and had come really close to doing so, Cinemaware would now fade into history. Bob Jacob and the majority of Cinemaware's key employees have no doubt in their mind that the NEC deal was the death blow for the company, that it was a terrible mistake. Even the piracy that their games were often stricken with, Cinemaware made a lot of efforts to stop their games from being pirated and suffered from it pretty hard, was not considered by Jacob as a factor in Cinemaware's demise, not nearly as much as that NEC deal. It's hard to disagree, really. The NEC deal was a great shame indeed. More than a lot of things, though, there was what turned out to be bad timing in a scene where, admittedly, the future was uncertain. Had Cinemaware waited another year to make that FMV version of Desert, things would have probably turned out okay. They could have gone with someone like Sega, or they'd have worked with Philips after all, or just gotten a better deal that wouldn't have utterly crippled the company. Anything would have been better than what ended up happening, really. A lot of Cinemaware retrospectives focus on this sudden burnout. Make no mistake, they didn't fade away. That's not what happens when you fly too close to the sun, as they did. In those 5 years, they really did take more than a few risks. Right from the beginning, in fact, that initial Mindscape deal, when they had to have 4 games ready inside of a year, that came within inches of going wrong, and if it had, we wouldn't still be talking about them today. We still remember the classic Cinemaware, even though they're long dead, for their sheer audacity. They may have been criticised a lot at the time, but they had such a strong vision for gaming's future. It wasn't necessarily a fully correct vision, but they utterly believed in it. And in the end, well, we still have one more game to cover. By the time that it was released for the Amiga in late 1990, the die was already cast. Things were so bad that realistically there was no way it was going to save the company. But that didn't mean they'd half-arse it. If Cinemaware were to die, they would do so kicking and screaming. And their final game, in the end, is as appropriate a coda for a games company as there has ever been. It is in many ways ironic that Cinemaware's final game would, in the end, be inspired more by reality and history than it would be by the movies, although naturally it didn't start out this way. Bob Jacobs' idea, which he gave to John Cutter, was to make a game based on the 1927 silent movie classic Wins, the first film to win an Academy Award for Best Picture. Wins, one of the most important films made about the First World War, is still renowned even today for the quality of its flying and dogfight scenes, performed as they were by actual World War I pilots in the same types of plane. No CGI in those days, folks. Being as it was over 60 years old then, Jacob also felt that it would be a pretty safe bet to take from the game copyright-wise. From there, however, Cutter took a different route. In his research, he found accounts and stories of the real pilots of the war, and a project that at first wasn't of great interest to him became a fascinating obsession. In particular, according to Jimmy Mayo of the Digital Antiquarian, without whose sterling work a lot of this video would have admittedly not been possible, Cutter's main inspiration was the personal diary of Mick Mannock, a British fighter ace who achieved a total of 61 victories before himself being shot down and killed in July 1918. And so, Wins quickly moved beyond the silent Hollywood inspiration. The end result is a piece-by-piece, day-by-day account of the Great War in the Skies, taking place from March 2nd, 1916 to November 10th, 1918. It is by far the longest Cinemaware game. As a day-by-day account of each of your pilot's sorties, the game features over 200 missions. It's not the most varied of games either. There's mostly dogfighting, bombing enemy camps, and strafing ground emplacements. From a strictly ludic perspective, Wins gets repetitive very quickly. And yet, more than any other Cinemaware game, it rides on the strength of a very matter-of-fact and very real narrative. Wins rightly stands as one of the most powerful war games created to this very day. The subject matter itself, the harrowing nature of the First World War, lends itself to this of course, but Wins stands as a firm, bittersweet and respectful tribute to those magnificent men in their flying machines. Every day, every sortie is accompanied by another extract from the pilot's journal. In this way, Wins writes characters and gives life to seemingly simplistic, primitive polygons in a way that few other games have managed before or since. The journal entries vary in tone, gradually getting more depressing as the horrors of the war fully take hold, as every day the casualties continue to rise. 5 men may take off in the morning, but less and less seem to come back in the afternoon. It is very likely that from time to time you will be one of those who don't come back. It is quite easy to lose a dogfight, or fly too close to the ground, or do any manner of things which will result in your death and your quiet funeral. But the game does not end with your pilot's death. You are not taken back to the beginning. Instead, you're put in the place of another pilot, and the game carries on. Only at the war's end are you greeted with a full memorial of all your lost pilots. Quite a powerful final touch. Therefore, you don't necessarily have to excel at the gameplay to respect the truly powerful experience that Wins becomes as the war marches on, as the journal recounts the attempts by Holy Joe to keep morale up, fights in the mess hall, the slaughter unleashed on the squads by Baron von Richthofen and his flying circus. It can be a poetic, a harrowing, and even an emotional experience at times, which is appropriate. The flight sim part might be somewhat primitive, but it doesn't aim for bells and whistles. It wants feel, to emulate a pilot with naught but a rudder and a gun, and technical limitations aside, it manages to do this. And what a game to go out on. Wins is, in part, different from most other Cinemaware games. In this final flourish, there is no curtain, no screen, no actors. The Hollywood influence was there at the beginning, but was then gradually removed. And yet, it might just be the studio's greatest achievement. Taking the Cinemaware formula and applying it to reality in such a way resulted in something completely different. The Cinemaware formula may not have been the direction in which games went, but Wins, and others, proved its power in many ways. It stands as possibly the greatest last testament in the history of gaming, a game of such power and evocation that in these regards it's almost on its own. There's a wistfulness and drive about Cinemaware's remembrance, a true dedication to keeping their games alive, hence the revival of the name in the 2000s, or the constant passing around of its IPs to ensure that they stay alive. Some could see these games as relics of a path that was not taken, but clearly that's not the case, and these games do still have a unique power. As short as the studio's life was, that's a power that will live forever. Bye for now. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, then you could subscribe, leave comments, like, and indeed support me on Patreon. If you do, you could join this list here of awesome people whom the community would like to thank. Adam Schaefer, Alex Stocco, Alexander Jazeri, Andrew Dalton, Andy Capt, Daniel Briggs, Daniel David Taylor, Dustin Cooper, Gary Pinkett, George Newton, Grafham Blackpool, Ian Roberts, James Idd, James Loveridge, Jason Durso, Jason Goy, Jason Stevens, Jace Alexander, Josh Jensen, Lee Norris, Mark Greaves, Martin Pataki, Mike's Games Room, Morton Scarnin, Nanette McCrone, Nicholas Tristan, Olaf Albeen, Peter Jack, Peter Sidorn, Phil Taprog, Potter Margel, Pocky Southmaid, Rachel Maxwell, Romeo, Ryan Burford, Sammy Lee, Samuel Victor, Scott Coulter, Seth Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Stephen Warner, Tanya Jay, Yucca Operator, and Zach Roach.